I am Roland, 72 years old, and I spent my entire life building a $100 million empire from the dirt up. I never told my son about my wealth because I wanted him to be his own man. Last Friday, his wife kicked my worn-out work boots into the pouring rain and called me a freeloader in front of her country club friends. My son just sipped his wine and looked away. So I packed my single bag, walked out the door, and made one phone call to freeze every dime they had. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not given. The heavy oak front door of my son's suburban mansion swung open with a violent thud. The freezing October rain was coming down in sheets, blowing onto the pristine marble entryway. I stood in the hallway wearing my simple gray sweater, watching as my daughter-in-law Harper marched toward the door. In her hand, held away from her expensive silk dress using only 2 manicured fingers, were my work boots. They were not just any boots. They were the leather steel-toed boots I bought 40 years ago when I started my first freight route. The leather was cracked, the soles were worn unevenly, and they carried the permanent scent of motor oil and hard labor. To me, they were a monument to survival. To Harper, they were trash. With a look of absolute disgust, she wound up and tossed my boots straight out the open door. They bounced off the wet stone steps and landed in a muddy puddle in the driveway. A chorus of gasps echoed from the formal dining room behind her. 7 of her wealthy country club friends were seated around the mahogany table, their expensive dinners completely forgotten. They watched me with wide eyes, a mix of pity and amusement dancing on their faces. Harper slammed the door shut, wiping her hands on a linen napkin as if she had just touched a disease. She turned to face me, her face flushed with anger and too much expensive champagne. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "You are just a freeloader, old man," she sneered, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am sick and tired of tripping over your filthy garbage in my beautiful home. You contribute absolutely nothing to this house. You do not pay rent. You do not help with the mortgage. You just sit around taking up space, bringing down the value of everything you touch." The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was the rain beating against the large glass windows. I did not yell. I did not raise my hands. I simply stood there and let her words hang in the air. My eyes drifted past Harper, looking into the dining room where my son Andre was sitting at the head of the table. Andre. The boy I had sacrificed my youth to protect. The boy whose private school tuition was paid with my sweat and bleeding hands. I looked at him, waiting for him to stand up, waiting for him to tell his wife to show some respect to his father, waiting for him to be a man. Instead, Andre refused to meet my gaze. He looked down at the crisp white tablecloth, nervously swirling the dark red wine in his crystal glass. He took a long, slow sip, completely ignoring the fact that his wife had just humiliated his father in front of a room full of strangers. "Come on, Harper," Andre mumbled weakly, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "Let us just finish dinner. We can talk about this later." "No, Andre. We are talking about this right now," Harper snapped, walking over and placing her hands firmly on the back of his chair. "Your father needs to leave. I have already looked into it. There is a state-run facility on the east side of town. It is perfectly adequate for someone in his financial situation. I want him packed and out of my house by Monday. I cannot host another dinner party with him lurking around like a ghost." Andre finally looked up, but not at me. He looked at his friends, offering them an apologetic, pathetic little smile. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as if I were the biggest burden in the world. "Dad, maybe she is right," Andre said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It is getting too crowded here. You need specialized care anyway. The state facility is not that bad. They have activities. It is just time for you to move on. We have our own lives to build." I stared at my son. The absolute cowardice in his voice did not make me angry. It made me incredibly tired. He honestly believed he was the king of this castle. He believed he was a successful tech entrepreneur providing a lavish lifestyle for his beautiful wife. He believed I was just a broke retired mechanic who needed charity to survive. What Andre did not know, and what he was about to find out the hard way, was the truth about the wine he was currently drinking. It was a rare vintage Cabernet costing roughly $200 a bottle. He bought it using a black corporate credit card tied to his supposed angel investment firm. That angel investment firm did not exist. It was a dummy corporation I set up 5 years ago. I was the angel investor. I was the one funding his failing tech startup. I was the one paying the mortgage on this sprawling estate. I was the one paying for Harper's silk dresses, her country club memberships, and the very food on that mahogany table. Every single dime they had ever touched came directly from Vanguard Holdings, the logistics empire I built from nothing. As I stood there listening to them discuss throwing me into a miserable state facility, my mind drifted back to the 1980s. I remembered walking into a marble bank lobby in downtown Chicago wearing my best suit, asking for a small business loan to buy my second delivery truck. The white loan officer had laughed in my face, telling me that people like me did not have the discipline to run a business. I remembered walking out of that bank fueled by a cold, burning rage. I did not sleep for a decade. I survived on 3 hours of rest a night, driving trucks through blizzards, loading heavy cargo until my joints screamed in agony, negotiating contracts in diners at 2 in the morning. I built Vanguard Holdings truck by truck, warehouse by warehouse, until it became a $100 million behemoth. I did all of that so my son would never have to face the humiliation I faced. I wanted him to start on third base. I gave him the best education, the best clothes, the safest neighborhoods. But looking at him now, shrinking in his chair while his wife berated me, I realized my fatal mistake. By shielding him from the cold wind of reality, I had raised a weak, entitled boy who did not know the value of a dollar or the meaning of loyalty. I looked at Harper. She was standing tall, her arms crossed, a triumphant smirk on her face. She thought she had won. She thought she had finally taken out the trash. "Monday," she repeated, tapping her foot. "I want you gone by Monday morning. Do not make me call the authorities to have you removed." I let out a slow, quiet breath. The corners of my mouth curled up into a small, genuine smile. I did not feel humiliated anymore. I felt free. The invisible chains of paternal obligation had just snapped. I owed this boy nothing. "You do not have to wait until Monday." "Harper," I said. My voice was calm, deep, and steady. It cut through the tension in the room like a sharp blade. I turned my back on them and walked slowly down the hallway to the small guest room they had assigned to me. I did not have much to pack, just a few shirts, my shaving kit, and a framed photograph of my late wife. I placed them neatly into my canvas duffel bag and zipped it shut. I did not look around the room. I had no attachment to this house. It was just a building paid for by my money. When I walked back into the entryway, the dinner party was completely silent. They were all watching me, waiting for me to beg, waiting for me to cause a scene. Harper had a smug look of satisfaction plastered across her face. Andre was still looking at his wine glass. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the freezing October rain. I walked down the wet stone steps, my socks soaking up the cold water instantly. I bent down, picked up my muddy work boots, and tucked them under my arm. I did not look back. I did not say goodbye. I just walked down the long, winding driveway into the darkness. When I reached the end of the street, safely out of sight of their glowing mansion, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I wiped the raindrops from the screen and dialed a number I had memorized decades ago. It rang twice before a sharp, no-nonsense voice answered on the other end. "Malcolm," I said, the cold rain dripping from my chin. Roland, my ruthless business partner, replied, "It is late. What is going on?" "It is time," I said softly, watching the headlights of a passing car reflect off the wet pavement. "They just kicked me out. They told me I am a freeloader." A dark, low chuckle echoed through the phone speaker. Malcolm had been telling me for years that my son was bleeding me dry and that his wife was a parasite. He had been waiting for this exact phone call. "So what is the play, old friend?" Malcolm asked, the anticipation thick in his voice. "Pull the plug," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "All of it. Freeze the startup funding, cancel the corporate credit cards, stop the mortgage payments. I want the house, the cars, and every single cent we ever gave them cut off immediately. Let us see how the king and queen survive when the freeloader stops paying the bills." "Consider it done," Malcolm said. "By tomorrow morning, their entire world is going to burn down." "Where are you going to sleep tonight?" "I am going to a hotel," I replied, pulling my collar up against the wind. "The penthouse suite at the Four Seasons. Put it on the company card, the real one." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The rain was coming down harder now, but I did not feel cold. For the first time in years, the fire inside me was roaring back to life. They thought they had thrown away a helpless old man. They had no idea they had just declared war on a titan. And tomorrow morning, when their credit cards declined and the eviction notices arrived, they were going to learn a very painful lesson about respect. I sat in the leather armchair of my penthouse suite at the Four Seasons, watching the morning sun rise over the Chicago skyline. The coffee in my hand was black and bitter, just the way I like it. I knew exactly what was happening at that very moment in the sprawling suburban mansion I had left behind. I knew because I had built the entire artificial world my son and his wife lived in, and last night I had turned off the sun. While I was checking into my hotel, Andre and Harper were busy celebrating my departure. I could easily picture the scene. Harper probably poured another glass of that $200 Cabernet, laughing about how she finally got the old man out of her hair. She probably told Andre that the house finally felt like theirs, completely ignoring the fact that her name was nowhere on the deed. They were so drunk on their own arrogance that they decided to reward themselves. According to the alert that pinged on my phone at 1 in the morning, Harper tried to book a $15,000 luxury ski vacation to Aspen. First-class flights, a private chalet, ski instructors, the works. She typed in the black corporate card number, the one she treated like an endless fountain of my blood and sweat, and hit purchase. Declined. I smiled into my coffee cup, just thinking about it. She probably tried it again. Declined. She probably woke Andre up complaining that his stupid bank was blocking her transaction. Andre, being the arrogant fool I raised him to be, likely assured her it was just a fraud alert. He probably told her he would call the platinum concierge in the morning and sort it out. He went to sleep believing he was still a king. He had no idea the castle had already crumbled. The next morning, Andre did not even bother calling the bank. He had bigger fish to fry. Today was the day he was supposed to close the lease on his new tech startup headquarters. It was a massive 10,000 square foot open plan office in the trendiest district of the city. Exposed brick, polished concrete floors, a kombucha bar. All the ridiculous things people who do not actually work think they need to be successful. Andre drove his imported German sports car to the commercial real estate office wearing a bespoke suit I had unknowingly paid for. He walked into that glass conference room with the swagger of a self-made titan. He sat down across from the senior leasing agent, a man who had been rushing this deal because he thought Andre was sitting on a gold mine. Andre was expecting a $2 million wire transfer to hit the escrow account that morning. That money was the seed funding for his revolutionary new app. He told all his friends he had secured an anonymous angel investor who believed in his vision. He bragged about how his brilliant pitch deck had won over a mysterious billionaire. That mysterious billionaire was me. That angel investment firm was a shell company managed by Vanguard Holdings. And at 8 o'clock that morning, Malcolm had legally dissolved the funding agreement. The leasing agent walked into the conference room holding a manila folder, but he was not smiling. He did not offer Andre a celebratory espresso. He sat down heavily, looking at Andre with a mixture of confusion and pity. Andre leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs, completely oblivious to the shift in the room. He probably clapped his hands together and asked where he needed to sign so he could get the keys and start moving his ping-pong tables into the new office. The folder slid across the heavy wooden table. "There is a problem with the wire transfer," the agent said, his voice flat and professional. It did not clear. In fact, the escrow account manager received a formal notice of withdrawal. "Your funding has been pulled, every single penny of it." I can only imagine the look on my son's face. The color must have drained from his cheeks as the reality tried to penetrate his thick skull. He probably laughed a nervous, high-pitched sound and told the agent there must be some clerical error. He reached into his tailored pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened his banking app to prove the agent wrong. But the app showed nothing but zeros and frozen accounts. The $2 million was gone. The operating budget was gone. His personal checking account, tied to the same corporate umbrella, was locked solid. "Listen," the agent said, standing up and closing the folder. "We had other offers on this space. We only held it because your investor showed proof of funds last week. Since those funds are no longer available, we are terminating the lease agreement. I need you to leave my office so I can call the next tenant on the list." Andre was thrown out into the street. The self-proclaimed tech genius was suddenly just a man in an expensive suit with no money to his name. He stood on the sidewalk staring at his reflection in the glass building, completely shattered. He should have seen this coming. He should have known that his success was a manufactured illusion. This was not the first time his grand business ideas had gone up in smoke. It was just the first time I was not there to sweep the ashes under the rug. 3 years ago, he wanted to start a cryptocurrency exchange. He lost $500,000 in 6 months. He cried in my living room, begging me to help him avoid bankruptcy. I quietly paid off his creditors through a blind trust so his country club friends would not find out he was a failure. 2 years before that, it was an organic dog food delivery service. He leased a fleet of vans and hired a marketing team before he even had a product. That venture burned through $300,000 before it collapsed. I covered payroll out of my own pocket so his employees would not lose their homes. And before that, it was a boutique consulting firm where he paid himself a massive salary to sit in an empty office and play golf. I bailed him out every single time. I wiped his nose, patted his back, and told him the next idea would be the winner. I did it because I loved him. I did it because I grew up with absolutely nothing, wearing shoes with holes in the soles, and I could not bear to see my flesh and blood suffer. But my protection became his poison. By catching him every time he fell, I taught him that gravity did not apply to him. I taught him that he could be reckless, arrogant, and cruel, and the world would just magically fix itself. Yesterday, when he sat there sipping wine while his wife treated me like a stray dog, I realized I had not raised a man. I had raised a parasite, and the only way to cure a parasite is to starve it. Standing on the sidewalk, panic finally set in. Andre dialed the phone number for his anonymous angel investor. The phone rang and rang, echoing in his ear like a death knell. Finally, a cold, automated voice answered. It was not the enthusiastic portfolio manager he usually spoke to. It was the legal department at Vanguard Holdings. A paralegal answered the phone. Andre started shouting, demanding to know why his funds were frozen, threatening to sue them for breach of contract. He screamed that he was a visionary and that they were making the biggest mistake in corporate history. The paralegal did not raise her voice. She simply read from a prepared statement Malcolm had drafted that morning. "Mr. Andre," she said, her tone devoid of any human empathy. Section 4, paragraph 12 of your funding agreement contains a strict moral turpitude and ethical conduct clause. Your primary investor has determined that your recent personal conduct violates this clause. Specifically, your failure to provide basic dignity and shelter to your immediate family members has been deemed a liability to our corporate values. All funding is permanently revoked. Do not contact this office again. The line went dead. Andre dropped his phone. The screen cracked on the concrete sidewalk, a fitting metaphor for his life. The anonymous investor knew about last night. The investor knew about the boots in the rain. For the first time in his life, Andre was facing the devastating consequences of his own actions, and there was no safety net to catch him. Meanwhile, back at the suburban mansion, Harper was experiencing her own version of a meltdown. She had spent the entire morning trying to order designer clothes online, only to have every single credit card declined. She called the bank and screamed at a customer service representative, threatening to have them fired, only to be told the accounts were frozen by the primary account holder. Harper did not care about Andre's startup. She did not care about his app. She only cared about the flow of cash that maintained her social status. If the plastic cards were not working, she needed liquid assets. She needed cash immediately to pay the caterer for a brunch she was hosting that weekend, because canceling the brunch would mean admitting to her friends that she was broke. Furious and impatient, Harper marched out to the detached 3-car garage. She ignored Andre's imported sports car and walked straight toward the back corner where a heavy canvas tarp covered a large vehicle. It was the car I had left behind. The car Harper had constantly complained about, calling it a rusty piece of junk that was ruining the aesthetic of her beautiful home. She grabbed the edge of the tarp and yanked it back, revealing the faded, dusty exterior. She looked at it not with respect, but with greedy, desperate eyes. She pulled out her phone and searched for the nearest auto salvage yard that paid cash on the spot. She figured she could get a few $1,000s for the scrap metal, enough to cover her brunch and keep up appearances for a few more days. She smiled a cold, calculating smile. She thought she was being resourceful. She thought she was just getting rid of my garbage to solve her problems. She had absolutely no idea that she was about to commit a major felony that would put her in handcuffs before the sun went down. I was miles away, sitting comfortably in my hotel suite, but I knew the exact layout of the trap Harper was blindly walking into. She was a woman who understood the price of everything, but the value of absolutely nothing. That morning, her pristine world was collapsing. Every piece of plastic in her designer wallet had been declined. The bank tellers had hung up on her. The automated phone systems had locked her out. She was trapped in a financial desert of her own making. But Harper was not the type to reflect on her actions or ask for forgiveness. Her pride demanded immediate cash. She had a luxury catered brunch to host on Sunday, and in her shallow high society circle, canceling an event was equal to social suicide. She stormed out to the detached 3-car garage of the mansion, her high heels clicking aggressively against the polished concrete floor. She ignored the empty space where Andre usually parked his imported sports car. Instead, she marched straight to the back corner. There, sitting quietly in the shadows, was my car. It was covered by a heavy, dust-stained canvas tarp. To Harper, it was just a rusted eyesore. It was the old man's junk, a pathetic remnant of a low-class life she desperately wanted to erase from her property. She grabbed the edge of the heavy canvas and ripped it back, coughing as a cloud of dust filled the air. Beneath the tarp sat a vehicle with faded, weathered paint patches of exposed primer and a body that looked like it had survived a war. Harper sneered at it. She pulled out her phone and furiously searched for local salvage yards and independent mechanics who paid cash for junk cars. She found a local garage owner named Victor who advertised fast cash for old clunkers. She called him, demanding he come to her affluent suburban address immediately. She told him she had an abandoned piece of garbage taking up space in her garage, and if he brought $5,000 in cash, he could tow it away, no questions asked. Victor arrived an hour later in a battered tow truck. He was a man who actually worked for a living, his hands permanently stained with grease. He walked up the long, manicured driveway, looking completely out of place among the sculpted hedges and marble fountains. Harper stood by the open garage door, her arms crossed, looking at Victor as if he were a peasant allowed onto the royal grounds. She pointed at the car and told him to give her the cash and get the heap of metal out of her sight before her neighbors saw it. Victor walked slowly around the car. He did not see a rusted piece of junk. Victor had been working on engines his entire life. He noticed the aggressive stance of the wheels. He noticed the distinct muscular curve of the rear quarter panels. He noticed the custom exhaust pipes peeking out from beneath the rear bumper. He reached out and touched the faded hood. To an untrained, arrogant eye like Harper, the car looked neglected. To a master mechanic like Victor, the truth was blindingly obvious. The car was a pristine, fully restored 1969 Shelby GT 500. I bought that car on a rainy Tuesday in the late 80s, the exact same day I secured my very first $1 million logistics contract. While other men in my position went out and bought shiny new European sports cars to show off their sudden wealth, I chose the Shelby. I spent a fortune having the engine completely rebuilt by a master craftsman. Underneath the hood, it was a mechanical masterpiece, pushing out over 600 horsepower with flawless precision. But I specifically ordered the exterior to be finished with a custom patina. I wanted the car to look faded, worn, and bruised. I wanted it to look exactly like me. I was a black man who had been beaten down by the world, scarred by poverty and discrimination, but underneath the surface, I possessed an unstoppable, terrifying power. That car was my soul, cast in steel. It was registered directly to the Vanguard Holdings Corporate Trust, and its appraised insurance value was $2.5 million. Victor pulled a rag from his back pocket and wiped a thick layer of dust from the dashboard, revealing the vehicle identification number stamped on the metal plate near the windshield. He pulled out his phone and typed the number into a national database he used to check for stolen vehicles. He stood in the quiet garage, waiting for the results to load. When the screen refreshed, Victor stopped breathing. The database confirmed the make and model. It also confirmed the registered owner was a corporate trust belonging to a billion-dollar logistics empire, and most importantly, it listed the estimated auction value, $2.5 million. Victor slowly looked up from his phone and stared at Harper. She was tapping her foot impatiently, checking her diamond watch, demanding to know if he had the $5,000 in cash or if she needed to call someone else. Victor realized immediately what was happening. This wealthy, arrogant suburban housewife was trying to fence a multi-million-dollar stolen vehicle for pennies. She did not have the title. She did not have the keys. She did not even know what she was looking at. Victor was an honest man, and he knew that getting involved in the unauthorized sale of a corporate-owned masterpiece would land him in federal prison for the rest of his life. He cleared his throat, put his phone back in his pocket, and forced a polite smile. He told Harper he needed to call his business partner to authorize a cash withdrawal that large. He told her he would wait by his tow truck. Harper rolled her eyes, told him to hurry up, and walked back into her massive house to pour herself a drink, completely unaware that the trap had just snapped shut around her ankles. Victor walked down the driveway, climbed into the cab of his tow truck, locked the doors, and immediately dialed 911. He reported a suspected grand theft auto in progress at the mansion. He gave the dispatcher the vehicle identification number and explained that the woman living there was attempting to illegally sell a corporate asset worth millions of dollars without documentation. Less than 15 minutes later, the quiet, exclusive peace of the suburban neighborhood was violently shattered. 4 police cruisers came tearing around the corner, their sirens screaming, and their red and blue lights flashing against the pristine white facades of the surrounding mansions. They swarmed the driveway, blocking the entrance so no one could escape. Neighbors began stepping out of their homes, their eyes wide with shock and morbid curiosity as heavily armed officers stepped out of their vehicles. Inside the house, Harper heard the sirens. She probably thought there had been an accident on the main road. She walked to the front window, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, expecting to see a passing ambulance. Instead, she saw a nightmare unfolding on her own front lawn. 2 officers marched up the stone steps and pounded heavily on the custom oak door. Harper opened it, her face a mask of furious indignation. She demanded to know what they were doing on her property and threatened to call the police chief, claiming she knew him personally. The lead officer did not flinch. He asked her if she had just attempted to sell the 1969 Shelby parked in the garage. Harper laughed condescendingly. She told the officer it was just her father-in-law's abandoned junk, and she had every right to dispose of it. She admitted right there on the front porch in front of the officers and the growing crowd of wealthy neighbors that she had negotiated a cash sale for the vehicle. The officer nodded, slowly, pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, and informed Harper that the vehicle in question was valued at $2.5 million and belonged to Vanguard Holdings. He told her she was being placed under arrest for attempted grand theft auto and possession of stolen corporate property. Harper dropped her crystal glass. It shattered against the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing through the grand entryway. The color completely drained from her face. She started screaming frantically, waving her arms, claiming it was a misunderstanding, claiming I had set her up. The officers ignored her desperate cries. They grabbed her arms, twisted them roughly behind her back, and locked the cold steel cuffs around her wrists. They dragged her down the front steps, her expensive designer dress dragging through the same muddy puddle where she had thrown my work boots just the night before. At that exact moment, Andre turned his sports car onto the street. He had just been thrown out of the commercial real estate office. He had just lost his $2 million startup funding. He was driving home in a state of absolute panic, hoping to find comfort in his perfect suburban sanctuary. Instead, he hit the brakes and stared in total horror. His beautiful house was surrounded by flashing police lights. The neighbors he spent years trying to impress were standing on their lawns, whispering and pointing. And right in the center of the chaos, his elegant, arrogant wife was being pushed into the back of a police cruiser, crying hysterically and screaming his name. Andre sat in his car, his hands trembling violently on the leather steering wheel. He watched the police cruiser doors slam shut, trapping Harper inside. The illusion of his success, his power, and his perfect life did not just crack. It completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. And the most terrifying part was that he finally realized this was only the beginning. The freeloader he had discarded was not just a helpless old man. He was the architect of their destruction, and the demolition had officially commenced. I spent my second evening at the hotel watching the city lights blink against the dark glass of my window. My phone had remained completely silent. Not a single apology from my son. No sudden realization of his own failures. Instead, Andre was busy frantically trying to put out the massive fire his wife had started. I knew exactly how he was spending his night because my security team provided me with regular updates. When the police dragged Harper away in handcuffs for attempting to fence a $2.5 million corporate asset, Andre had followed them to the precinct in a state of absolute panic. He had marched up to the front desk wearing his expensive tailored suit, fully expecting his usual arrogant charm to smooth things over. He demanded his wife be released immediately. He told the desk sergeant there had been a simple misunderstanding over an abandoned junk car. The police did not care about his suit or his attitude. They informed him that grand theft auto involving corporate property was a major felony and bail had been set at $100,000. They told him he needed 10% in cash to walk her out the door. $10,000. For a man who claimed to be a tech visionary, $10,000 should have been loose change in his pocket. But his anonymous angel investor had just cut him off. His bank accounts were frozen. His platinum credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. Desperation makes fools out of arrogant men. Instead of sitting down and figuring out why his funds were locked, Andre left the precinct and drove straight to a predatory bail bondsman on the bad side of town. He signed a high-interest loan agreement, putting up his own imported sports car as collateral just to get the $10,000 in cash. He essentially traded his prized possession to a loan shark because he could not bear the thought of his perfect wife spending the night in a cold, concrete cell. When Harper finally walked out of those heavy steel doors early the next morning, she did not look humbled. She did not cry on his shoulder or thank him for saving her. She was vibrating with pure narcissistic rage. Her designer silk dress was wrinkled and stained, her makeup was smeared across her face, and the moment she saw Andre waiting by his car, she unleashed a torrent of screaming abuse that echoed across the precinct parking lot. She did not blame herself for trying to sell a car she did not own. She blamed me. She screamed that it was all my fault for leaving stolen property in her garage. She accused me of setting a trap to humiliate her in front of her country club friends and the entire neighborhood. She demanded that Andre do something to destroy me. She wanted revenge against the useless old freeloader who had ruined her perfect life and forced her to endure the ultimate indignity of a holding cell. And Andre, the boy I had shielded from every hardship, simply nodded his head. He agreed with her. He told her I was a bitter, jealous old man who wanted to sabotage their success. They convinced themselves that the frozen accounts and the pulled startup funding were just temporary bank errors caused by the chaos of my sudden departure. They decided that the best way to handle the situation was to crush me legally. They wanted to teach me a lesson about respect. By noon, Andre and Harper were sitting in the plush downtown office of a high-powered litigation attorney. They had chosen the most expensive law firm they could find, a place with mahogany walls and leather chairs, assuming they would just bill the consultation to their corporate accounts later. They sat across the polished desk from a senior partner spinning a wild tale of elder abuse and emotional distress. Andre confidently explained to the attorney that his elderly father had suffered a mental break. He claimed I had abandoned a stolen vehicle on their property, causing his wife severe emotional trauma, public humiliation, and wrongful imprisonment. He instructed the attorney to draft a massive lawsuit against me for damages. He wanted to sue me for everything I had, assuming I had a small pension or a modest savings account he could drain to pay off the bail bondsman. The attorney listened patiently, taking neat notes on his legal pad. He saw two wealthy, well-dressed suburbanites and assumed this would be an easy case to extract a quick settlement from a confused old man. He asked Andre for my full legal name and my social security number so his paralegal could run a preliminary background check and locate my assets. Andre happily provided the information, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile. He probably pictured me sitting in some dingy motel room, trembling at the thought of facing his high-powered legal team. He told the attorney not to worry about my ability to pay, suggesting they could just garnish my retirement checks until I died, while Andre and Harper sat in the office complaining about how much I had burdened their lives. The attorney walked over to his computer terminal to review the background search. He typed in my name. He expected to find a modest history, a rented apartment, an old bank account, maybe a small life insurance policy. Instead, the screen populated with a web of corporate structures so massive and complex it took his breath away. I never put anything in my own name. I learned very early in my life that a black man with visible wealth was always a target. When I started building my logistics empire in the 80s, I watched successful men in my community get sued into oblivion by predatory competitors or audited endlessly by the government. I decided I would be a ghost. I built a fortress of trusts holding companies and shell corporations. Vanguard Holdings owned the warehouse facilities. A subsidiary of Vanguard owned the trucks. Another subsidiary owned the real estate. I was the sole shareholder and the silent architect of a $100 million fortress, but on paper, Roland was just an employee with a modest salary. The attorney stared at his computer monitor, the color rapidly draining from his face. He clicked through the property records, trying to make sense of the data. He looked up the deed to the massive suburban mansion where Andre and Harper lived. The house they claimed was their sanctuary. The house where Harper had kicked my boots into the rain and called me a freeloader. The deed did not have Andre's name on it. It did not have Harper's name on it. The property was owned entirely by a real estate trust controlled by Vanguard Holdings. The attorney then checked the registration for Andre's tech startup office lease. Owned by Vanguard Holdings. He checked the origin of the bank accounts Andre used to pay the law firm's retainer fee. Vanguard Holdings. The attorney realized with sudden, horrifying clarity that he was not sitting across from a successful tech entrepreneur and a wealthy socialite. He He was sitting across from two unemployed dependents who were entirely funded by a billionaire ghost, and those two dependents were asking him to file a frivolous lawsuit against the very billionaire who owned the chairs they were currently sitting on. A heavy silence fell over the law office. The attorney slowly stood up from his desk. His hands were actually shaking as he picked up a document his paralegal had just printed and brought into the room. He did not look at Andre with respect anymore. He looked at him with a mixture of professional terror and profound pity. Andre noticed the shift in the room. He stopped talking about his emotional distress and frowned. He asked the attorney how fast they could get a judge to freeze my meager bank accounts. He wanted to make sure I could not hire my own legal representation. The attorney did not answer the question. He walked slowly back to his desk and sat down. He looked at the paperwork in his hands, then looked at Andre. "I cannot take your case," the attorney said, his voice completely devoid of its previous warmth. "In fact, I need you to leave my office immediately. I cannot bill you for this consultation because the accounts you provided have been flagged for unauthorized use of corporate funds." Harper gasped, slamming her hands on the desk. She demanded to know what he was talking about. She yelled that they were wealthy and could buy his entire law firm if they wanted to. "You do not have any money," the attorney said bluntly, losing his patience. "You do not have a startup. You do not even own the clothes you are wearing right now. Everything you possess belongs to Vanguard Holdings, and the man you just asked me to sue is the sole proprietor of that entire corporate umbrella." Andre froze. The air was sucked out of his lungs. He stared at the attorney, unable to process the words. He stammered, insisting there was a mistake, insisting I was just a retired mechanic who lived in his guest room. The attorney sighed and slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany desk. It stopped right in front of Andre. It was not a lawsuit. It was not a settlement offer. "Your father is not a freeloader," the attorney said quietly. "He is your landlord. And his corporate legal team faxed this to my office the moment they saw I was running a background check on his name." Andre looked down at the paper. The bold black letters at the top of the page seemed to vibrate before his eyes. It was a formal 48-hour eviction notice. It stated clearly that the occupants of the property had violated the terms of their unwritten lease agreement by engaging in criminal activity and property theft. It demanded they vacate the premises completely, leaving all corporate-owned furniture and assets behind or face immediate physical removal by armed security. Harper leaned over to read the paper. Her arrogant facade finally shattered. She let out a sharp, breathless sob, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The reality of her situation crashed down on her all at once. The bank accounts were not a glitch. The arrest was not a misunderstanding. The $15,000 Aspen vacation was never going to happen. Andre sat completely paralyzed in the leather chair. He finally understood the true weight of the worn-out work boots his wife had thrown into the puddle. He understood why I had smiled as I walked out into the cold rain. I had not been defeated. I had simply decided to stop paying for the stage, the lighting, and the costumes of their pathetic little play. The attorney pointed toward the door. "You have less than 2 days to pack whatever personal items you actually paid for yourselves," he said coldly. "I suggest you stop wasting time trying to sue a ghost and start looking for a cardboard box." I sat in my hotel suite watching the live feed from the high-definition security cameras I had installed around the suburban mansion. The cameras were technically corporate property originally meant to protect the Vanguard asset, but today they were broadcasting the greatest reality show I had ever seen. A sleek silver Mercedes-Benz pulled aggressively into the driveway, completely ignoring the muddy puddle where my work boots had been thrown just 2 nights ago. Out stepped Richard and Susan Harper's wealthy and unbearably arrogant parents. Richard was a local real estate developer who had made his fortune building cheap strip malls and overcharging small business owners. He wore a cashmere sweater draped over his shoulders, looking every bit the entitled country club patriarch who believed the rules did not apply to him. Susan rushed out of the passenger side, her face tight with panic and entirely too much plastic surgery. They had rushed over the exact moment Harper called them, sobbing hysterically about the 48-hour eviction notice and her brief, humiliating stint in the local police holding cell. Harper ran out the front door and threw herself into her mother's arms, crying about how her perfect life was being destroyed by a vindictive, crazy old man. Andre stood awkwardly on the porch, looking like a scolded child who had broken a toy he could not afford to replace. Richard did not hug his daughter. He marched directly up the stone steps, snatched the eviction notice from Andre's trembling hand, and aggressively scanned the document. I could see the pure condescension radiating from his posture. He scoffed loudly, shaking his head in disbelief. He slapped the paper against the back of his hand and laughed. He told Andre that this was nothing but a pathetic, desperate bluff. He said he dealt with corporate bullying all the time in his line of work, and that some senile old mechanic was not going to throw his precious daughter out onto the street. He promised Harper he would handle it immediately with his own high-priced litigation lawyers. He told them to go inside, pour a drink, and let a real man fix the mess they had stumbled into. Watching Richard puff out his chest on my front porch brought a very specific and painful memory bubbling to the surface of my mind. It was the day Andre and Harper got married. I had paid for the entire lavish ceremony, the imported flowers, the 5-course meal, the open bar that lasted until 2 in the morning. I stood in the reception hall wearing a rented tuxedo, feeling incredibly proud of my son and the life I had provided for him. Richard walked up to me before the guests arrived. I extended my hand to introduce myself formally as the groom's father. Richard did not take my hand. He looked down at my calloused fingers, then looked directly into my face and asked me with a perfectly straight face where the catering staff was setting up the champagne pyramid. He knew exactly who I was. He just wanted to put me in my place. He wanted to remind me that no matter how much money I had secretly poured into his daughter's new life, I was still just a black man with dirt under my fingernails and his eyes. I did not raise my voice that day. I quietly pulled my hand back, pointed toward the kitchen doors, and walked away. I kept my mouth shut because I did not want to ruin my son's wedding. I swallowed the bitter poison of his subtle racism because I thought it was the noble thing to do for my family. But I was not keeping quiet today. Today, Richard was stepping blindly onto a battlefield I had spent 40 grueling years mastering, and he had absolutely no idea he was entirely outgunned. Inside the house, Richard took total control of the dining room table. He spread out his legal pads and pulled out his expensive smartphone. Richard believed he owned the local real estate market. He knew the county clerks by their first names. He knew the local judges from his weekly golf games. He thought Vanguard Holdings was just some tiny, insignificant shell company I had set up with my meager retirement savings. He decided the best way to stop the 48-hour eviction was to bury the property in a mountain of legal red tape. He made a phone call to a corrupt buddy of his at the county records office. Richard instructed his friend to immediately file a fraudulent construction lien against the mansion. He claimed his own development company had performed $500,000 worth of structural renovations on the property over the last year and had never been paid. By placing a massive financial lien on the house, he would force the eviction process to a grinding halt while the court spent months sorting out the disputed debt. It was a dirty, highly illegal trick that Richard had used dozens of times to bleed small property owners dry and steal their equity. He hung up the phone with a smug, victorious smile, telling Harper and Andre that the house was safe and the Vanguard eviction was officially frozen. But Richard's massive ego demanded more than just a defensive move. He wanted to assert his absolute dominance over me. He found the contact number for Vanguard Holdings printed at the bottom of the eviction notice, picked up his phone, and dialed the corporate legal department. He did not know that the call was being routed directly to my ruthless business partner, Malcolm. And he certainly did not know that Vanguard recorded every single incoming call for corporate security and compliance purposes. Malcolm answered the phone with his usual cold, calculated professionalism. Richard did not even bother introducing himself. He immediately launched into a vicious tirade of threats and personal insults. He told Malcolm he had just tied up the suburban property with a massive mechanic's lien. He bragged aggressively about his political connections in the city and threatened to drag Vanguard Holdings through years of incredibly expensive bankrupting litigation. Richard's voice grew louder and more aggressive with every word. He told Malcolm that he was not going to let a bunch of street thugs try to steal his daughter's home using fake corporate paperwork. He deliberately used words like "you people" and "ghetto tactics," letting his deep-seated, long-held prejudice bleed through every single sentence. He told Malcolm to tell the old freeloader to back off immediately, or Richard would personally see to it that my entire life was ruined and I ended up sleeping on a park bench. Malcolm listened to the entire racist rant without interrupting once. He let Richard dig his own grave with every syllable. When Richard finally ran out of breath, Malcolm spoke in a voice as calm, steady, and heavy as a granite tombstone. Malcolm politely thanked Richard for his call. He thanked him for openly admitting on a recorded corporate line that he had just conspired to file a fraudulent lien against a multi-million-dollar corporate asset. And he very calmly informed Richard that Vanguard Holdings was not a small local mom-and-pop business he could bully with empty threats. Richard laughed nervously, telling Malcolm he could not be intimidated by cheap bluffs from amateur lawyers. He hung up the phone abruptly, feeling like a conquering hero. He turned to his daughter, poured himself a generous glass of my most expensive bourbon, and began boasting loudly about how he had just put the fear of God into my pathetic legal team. He took exactly one confident sip of that bourbon before his personal cell phone started to ring. It was not his corrupt buddy from the county records office. It was the senior vice president of the largest commercial bank in the state. This was the exact bank that held the mortgages for every single one of Richard's strip malls, office buildings, and luxury apartment complexes. Richard answered the phone with his usual booming confidence, but that artificial confidence evaporated in a matter of seconds. I watched the live security feed closely as the color completely drained from Richard's arrogant face, leaving him looking like a ghost. The crystal glass of bourbon slipped from his trembling hand and shattered violently on the hardwood dining room floor, sending amber liquid pooling around his expensive leather shoes. His banker was calling in a state of absolute panic. Vanguard Holdings had not just recorded the phone call. They had immediately forwarded the audio file along with irrefutable proof of the fraudulent lien to a powerful federal judge. Vanguard did not waste their time playing games in local county courts where Richard had friends. They bypassed the local system entirely and filed a massive federal countersuit for corporate fraud, tortious interference, and criminal extortion. Because Vanguard was a $100 million entity with significant national influence. The federal judge took the threat to our corporate assets very seriously. The judge had just issued an emergency immediate injunction. Richard's bank was legally obligated by federal law to instantly freeze his entire real estate portfolio. Every single business account he owned was locked. His massive lines of credit were completely severed. His access to his own wealth, his payroll accounts, and his personal savings were instantly vaporized pending a full federal fraud investigation. Richard could not breathe. He clutched his chest, sinking heavily into one of the dining room chairs. Harper rushed over to him, grabbing his shoulders frantically, asking what was wrong. Richard could not even form a complete sentence. He just stared blankly at the wall, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He realized in that devastating moment that his arrogant attempt to protect his entitled daughter had just cost him his entire life's work. In the span of a single hour, Richard went from a wealthy, politically connected real estate developer to a broken man facing decades in federal prison and absolute, inescapable bankruptcy. He had tried to play a dirty local game with a global titan. He had thought I was just the catering staff. He was learning right now that I owned the entire building the ground it stood on, and the very bank that financed his miserable existence. I turned off the security feed on my tablet and took another slow sip of my hot coffee. The board was slowly clearing. The pawns were falling one by one, eliminated by their own blinding greed. And my son, who still thought he could somehow salvage his broken artificial life, was rapidly running out of places to hide. While Richard watched his corrupt real estate empire disintegrate into absolute nothingness, Andre was desperately trying to glue the shattered pieces of his own artificial life back together. He spent the entire morning nervously pacing the expensive hardwood floors of the massive mansion he no longer owned, listening to his wife sob over their frozen bank accounts. His entitled brain refused to accept that the universe had stopped revolving around him. He firmly believed the sudden withdrawal of his $2 million startup funding was just a massive misunderstanding, a mere clerical error made by the bank. He convinced himself that if he could just get a face-to-face meeting with the anonymous chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, he could charm his way back into their good graces. He put on his expensive, tailored Italian suit and drove his heavily financed German sports car directly into the bustling financial district. He briefly thought about me, figuring I was shivering under a cold bridge somewhere, oblivious to the high-stakes corporate game he was about to play. He had no idea I was sitting in a luxury penthouse watching his every move. Vanguard Holdings was not just a company. It was a massive, imposing glass and steel skyscraper that dominated the city skyline, a monument to 50 years of relentless ambition. Andre boldly walked through the heavy revolving doors, his leather shoes clicking against the marble floors. expecting the red carpet treatment he always demanded. He leaned confidently against the polished stone reception counter, flashed his arrogant smile, and told the receptionist he was there to see the chief executive regarding a multi-million-dollar portfolio. The receptionist did not smile. She dealt with real billionaires every day and looked at Andre like a crippled gazelle. She coldly asked for his full name and his scheduled appointment time. When Andre admitted he did not have one but insisted his business was of the utmost urgency, she pointed a manicured finger toward a row of stiff leather chairs in the far corner of the massive lobby. She told him to wait. Andre was absolutely furious. He was used to simply snapping his fingers and having the entire world jump to attention. But in the towering cathedral of Vanguard Holdings, he was a nobody. He sat down expecting to wait 15 minutes. Instead, he waited for 6 agonizing hours. He sat there watching hundreds of real executives and power brokers walk past with purpose and authority. He watched men and women who had actually earned their wealth command the room while he was left ignored in the corner. His empty stomach growled loudly. His tailored suit started to feel suffocating. His expensive smartphone battery died entirely, leaving him completely disconnected from his crumbling world. With every passing hour, his fragile ego lost a little more air. He rapidly went from a demanding tech founder to a desperate, exhausted man begging for professional attention. Finally, as the sun began to set, a security guard walked over and told Andre that Mr. Malcolm would see him now. Andre was escorted into a private elevator that shot straight up to the top floor. The steel doors opened to reveal a sprawling executive suite with panoramic views of the darkening city. The walls were lined with original artwork and framed billion-dollar contracts. Sitting behind a massive desk carved from dark walnut was Malcolm. Malcolm was the ruthless enforcer of Vanguard Holdings, a man who spent decades destroying corporate rivals with cold precision. Andre stepped cautiously into the office, forcing a fake smile onto his pale face. He walked toward the desk, extending his hand, ready to launch into his practiced pitch about how his app would change the world. Malcolm did not stand up. He did not shake Andre's hand. He simply stared at him with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. He gestured sharply for Andre to sit. Andre nervously lowered his hand and sat down, his rehearsed speech dying completely in his throat. Malcolm reached into his drawer and pulled out a thick black leather-bound folder. He tossed it onto the desk with a heavy thud. He told Andre that the folder contained the comprehensive financial history of his pathetic, subsidized existence. It detailed every failed business venture, every silently bailed-out debt, every luxury vacation, and every single dime of the $4.5 million he had squandered over the last 10 years. Malcolm opened the folder and began reading the numbers aloud, his voice dripping with unfiltered disdain. He read off the massive financial losses from the catastrophic cryptocurrency exchange, the collapsed organic dog food delivery service, and the ridiculous boutique consulting firm. He broke down the exorbitant country club fees, the lease payments on the sports car, and the staggering mortgage on the suburban mansion. As Malcolm recited the endless list of unearned luxury, I sat in my quiet hotel room and remembered the exact agonizing price of that money. I remembered waking up at 3 in the morning, my back screaming from loading heavy wooden pallets, my hands cracked and bleeding from the freezing cold weather. I remembered skipping my own meals so I could pay the outrageous tuition for Andre's elite private academy. I sent him to those schools so he could learn how to be a strong leader and build something meaningful. Instead, he used that incredibly expensive education to build a massive wall of pure arrogance between himself and the real working world. He learned to look down his nose at honest blue-collar workers. He learned to sneer at men who got their hands dirty, the very same men like his own father who had paved the smooth roads he drove on. He treated waitresses, mechanics, and janitors like they were completely subhuman. Yet he had never actually earned a single honest dollar of his own. He was nothing but a highly educated parasite wearing a designer suit. Malcolm abruptly closed the heavy folder and leaned forward. He looked Andre dead in the eye and told him exactly what Vanguard Holdings thought of his new tech startup. He called it a bloated vanity project designed by a weak boy playing dress-up in the unforgiving world of real men. Andre sat trembling uncontrollably in his chair. His face was entirely pale, and a cold, clammy sweat broke out across his forehead. He desperately tried to defend himself, stammering weakly about his valuable intellectual property and his brilliant market projections. He literally begged Malcolm to reinstate the $2 million seed funding, promising repeatedly that he would work hard and pay back every single cent with high interest. He even offered to give Vanguard Holdings a much larger equity stake in the startup company. Malcolm let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed off the glass walls. He told Andre that Vanguard did not want equity in a rapidly sinking ship piloted by a blind captain. But Malcolm had not brought Andre all the way up to the top floor just to insult and humiliate him. He had brought him up there to spring the final inescapable trap. Malcolm pulled a single crisp sheet of paper from beneath the black folder and slid it slowly across the desk. It was an ironclad, legally binding contract. Malcolm explained the terms of the deal with brutal, terrifying clarity. During a recent forensic audit of Andre's previous failed business ventures, the corporate legal team had uncovered several massive, undeniable financial discrepancies. When Andre's disastrous cryptocurrency venture was collapsing 3 years ago, he had illegally transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars from the investor pool directly into his own personal accounts to maintain his lavish suburban lifestyle. Up until yesterday afternoon, Vanguard had quietly covered those stolen funds and buried the evidence to protect him from federal prosecution. But since the funding agreement had been permanently terminated due to his abhorrent personal conduct, Vanguard was no longer protecting him. Malcolm gave Andre 2 very simple life-altering choices. Choice 1, he could sign the paper currently resting on the desk, officially surrendering the entire intellectual property of his new startup, the keys to his imported sports car, and any remaining personal assets to Vanguard Holdings, as partial restitution for his unpaid debts. Choice 2, he could refuse to sign, walk out the door, and Malcolm would immediately hand the comprehensive forensic audit directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, absolutely guaranteeing Andre would spend the next 15 years of his life rotting in a maximum security federal prison for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. Andre stared blankly at the paper, his breathing shallow and rapid. The massive glass walls of the executive office felt like they were shrinking, closing in on him from every side. He had walked into the building fully believing he was a brilliant genius who just needed a second chance to prove his greatness. He was walking out finally realizing he was a pathetic criminal who had just lost his entire life. The drive back to the suburban mansion was the longest journey of my son's entire life. Andre sat behind the leather steering wheel of the imported sports car he no longer owned, staring blindly at the road ahead. The sky above the city had turned a bruised, heavy purple, perfectly matching the crushing reality that had just been dropped on his shoulders. He had signed the contract. He had surrendered the worthless intellectual property of his fake tech startup, handed over the keys to the vehicle he was currently driving, and legally accepted absolute financial ruin just to avoid spending the next 15 years in a federal prison cell. He drove through the massive iron gates of his neighborhood, the same gates he used to drive through, with a profound sense of unearned superiority. Now, the sprawling manicured lawns and towering white columns only mocked him. They were monuments to a life he had never actually earned and could no longer afford. He pulled into the wide circular driveway and slowly stepped out of the car. The rain from the previous night had finally stopped, but the cold wind bit through his thin designer suit. He walked up the stone steps, his legs feeling like they were made of solid lead. He pushed open the heavy front door, expecting to find some kind of comfort or solidarity from the woman he loved. Instead, he found chaos. Harper was in the master bedroom, frantically throwing expensive designer clothes and imported leather handbags into a massive, silk-lined suitcase. The bedroom looked like a high-end department store had been hit by a hurricane. Diamond jewelry, gold watches, and expensive cosmetics were scattered across the king-sized mattress. Harper was moving with a manic, desperate energy. She had spent the entire afternoon listening to her father Richard panic over the phone about his frozen bank accounts and the federal fraud investigation. She knew the suburban mansion was no longer a safe haven, but she still believed her family wealth would somehow save her from living like a common peasant. Andre stood in the doorway, his face pale and completely drained of emotion. He looked at his wife, hoping she would stop packing and hold him. He needed her to tell him that they would survive this together, that their marriage was stronger than the loss of a bank account. Harper did not even look up when he entered the room. She just kept stuffing cashmere sweaters into her luggage, complaining loudly about how the moving company she tried to hire had hung up on her because her credit card was declined again. Andre walked slowly into the room and sat on the edge of the mattress. He took a deep breath, staring at his empty hands. He told her in a quiet, broken voice that it was completely over. He explained that there was no clerical error, no temporary misunderstanding, and absolutely no secret startup funding left to salvage. He confessed that he had just signed away everything to Vanguard Holdings to avoid criminal prosecution for embezzling money from his own previous failed companies. He told her they were officially undeniably bankrupt and they had absolutely nothing left to their names except the clothes on their backs. Harper froze. Her hands stopped moving. The frantic energy in the room suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, suffocating silence. She slowly turned to face her husband. She did not rush over to comfort him. She did not offer a gentle touch or a word of encouragement. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. She looked at him from head to toe, her eyes scanning his expensive suit and his defeated posture, and she let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It was not a laugh of shock. It was a laugh of profound contempt. She asked him if he was joking. When Andre silently shook his head, a single tear rolling down his cheek, the final shred of her fake affection vanished completely. "You are absolutely pathetic," Harper hissed, her voice dripping with venom. She zipped up her massive suitcase with a violent jerk. She told him she had not married him to live in poverty. She admitted right there in the bedroom my money had paid for that she had only endured his endless string of foolish business ideas because she firmly believed he was sitting on a massive, untouchable trust fund. She called him a weak, useless loser who could not even protect his own wife from a senile old man. She told him that without his father's money, he was nothing but an empty suit playing pretend in a world of real men. She grabbed the handle of her luggage and marched toward the door, telling him she was going back to her parents where she belonged. She left him sitting alone on the edge of the bed in a house he had just been legally ordered to vacate. Sitting in my hotel room, reading the detailed security reports of their explosive argument, I did not feel a single ounce of surprise. I had known the dark, greedy truth about Harper since the very first week Andre brought her home to meet me. 5 years ago, when they announced their engagement, I had decided to test her loyalty. I hired an independent lawyer to draft a brutally restrictive prenuptial agreement and instructed Andre to present it to her. The document stated that in the event of a divorce, she would walk away with absolutely nothing and that all corporate assets were strictly off limits. The moment she read that document, she threw a massive screaming tantrum that lasted for 3 days. She accused Andre of not trusting her. She threatened to call off the wedding, weeping crocodile tears, and claiming she was deeply insulted that we would reduce their pure love to a financial transaction. Andre, completely blinded by his obsession with her, came to my house and begged me on his knees to drop the prenup requirement. He told me I was ruining his happiness and being overly cynical. Because I was weak, because I could not bear to see my son cry, I relented. I dropped the prenup and paid for the lavish wedding. I knew she was a parasite, but I let him marry her anyway, hoping he would eventually open his eyes. It took the complete destruction of his financial world for him to finally see the monster he had invited into his bed. Harper dragged her heavy suitcase down the grand staircase, her high heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floors. She walked out the front door, ignoring the eviction notice still taped to the glass. She did not have her luxury sports utility vehicle because it had been seized by the bail bondsman. She was forced to call a cheap rideshare service, shivering in the cold evening air as she waited at the end of the driveway. When the battered sedan finally arrived, she threw her bags into the trunk and ordered the driver to take her to her parents' exclusive gated community on the north side of the city. She sat in the back seat, furiously checking her phone, expecting her father to wire her some emergency cash so she could book a luxury hotel room and escape the nightmare. But Richard was not answering his phone. Susan was not answering her phone. The text messages she sent were left entirely unread. Harper convinced herself that her parents were simply busy strategizing with their high-powered lawyers, preparing a massive lawsuit to crush me and restore their honor. She pictured her father sitting in his mahogany study, smoking a cigar, ready to welcome her back into the warm embrace of generational wealth. She spent the entire 30-minute car ride planning exactly how she would spend her parents' money to exact revenge on me and humiliate Andre in the divorce proceedings. The rideshare pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of her parents' sprawling estate. The gates, which were usually heavily guarded by private security, were locked tight. The driver honked the horn, but no one came out of the guardhouse. Harper cursed loudly, stepping out of the car into the freezing night air. She grabbed her heavy suitcase and walked through the small pedestrian gate, her anger building with every step. She marched up the long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees, completely prepared to yell at the household staff for ignoring her arrival. But as she rounded the final corner, the breath was violently knocked out of her lungs. The mansion was not a safe haven. It was a scene of absolute devastation. Heavy commercial moving trucks were parked haphazardly on the manicured lawn. Federal agents in dark windbreakers stood on the front porch carrying out antique furniture. A massive white sign was pounded directly into the grass. It read "Federal foreclosure and asset seizure in progress." Harper stood in front of the cracked mirror of a cheap motel room on the edge of the city, frantically trying to fix her hair with a broken plastic comb. Her world was a smoldering ruin. Her husband was a bankrupt coward, her parents were facing federal prison, and her designer clothes were stuffed into a suitcase that smelled of stale cigarettes and disappointment. But Harper was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was a predator who believed she just needed one big score to reset the board. While scrolling through the local news on her dying phone, she saw a headline that made her heart stop. Vanguard Holdings was hosting its 40th anniversary charity gala that very night at the grandest hotel in the city. The article mentioned that the mysterious reclusive billionaire founder and chief executive officer would be making a rare public appearance to announce a massive global initiative. Harper did not see a corporate celebration. She saw a target. She believed that if she could just get 5 minutes alone with this man, she could use her beauty and her practiced charm to convince him to drop the lawsuits against her family. She would play the victim. She would tell him that a bitter old man had tricked her and that she was an innocent woman caught in a corporate crossfire. She spent 2 hours squeezing into her most expensive remaining evening gown, a shimmering emerald green silk dress that cost more than most people earned in a year. She applied her makeup with a precision that was almost terrifying, masking the dark circles under her eyes and the desperation in her soul. She spent her last $50 on a luxury car service to drop her off at the red carpet entrance. She did not have an invitation, but Harper had spent years perfecting the art of walking into rooms where she did not belong. She held her head high, flashed a fake smile at the overworked security guards, and told them her name was on the private list for the Real Estate Developers Association. In the chaos of the city's elite arriving in waves of diamonds and fur, she slipped through the heavy gold doors and disappeared into the crowd of the grand ballroom. The gala was a sea of absolute wealth and power. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged scotch, and the quiet hum of million-dollar deals being whispered in corners. Harper grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and immediately began her hunt. She did not just stand in the corner. She moved through the room like a shark weaving between senators, bank presidents, and tech titans. She introduced herself to everyone she met, spinning a meticulously crafted sob story. She told anyone who would listen that she was the victim of a massive, cold-blooded corporate conspiracy. She claimed that Vanguard Holdings was using its overwhelming power to crush her family and steal her home. She spoke about the trauma of her wrongful arrest, leaving out the part about the $2.5 million car she had tried to sell. She was performing the greatest role of her life, playing the tragic heroine ruined by a faceless, heartless corporation. She hoped her words would filter back to the mysterious chief executive and soften his heart before she even met him. I was not on the ballroom floor with the vultures and the socialites. I was standing in the shadows of the private VIP suite, directly above the ballroom, looking down through a wall of soundproof glass. I held a glass of ice water in my hand, watching Harper work the room. I could see her laughing with a prominent judge. I could see her touching the arm of a major developer, tilting her head back to show off her neck. She looked like a queen, but I knew she was a hollow shell. Watching her play the victim made a cold, hard knot of anger tighten in my chest. My mind drifted back to a freezing winter in 1974. I remembered my mother sitting at our small kitchen table, coughing into a blood-stained handkerchief. She had worked 3 jobs for 20 years, cleaning the houses of women exactly like Harper, just to keep a roof over our heads. When she got sick, we went to the local hospital, but we were turned away because we did not have insurance and we did not have the right kind of background. My mother died in our cramped apartment because she could not afford a $50 doctor visit and a bottle of basic antibiotics. That was a real tragedy. That was a real victim. Harper was standing in a room worth $10 million wearing a silk dress, complaining because she could no longer live a life of unearned luxury. The contrast was disgusting. I had built Vanguard Holdings to ensure that people like Harper could never again hold the power of life and death over people like my mother. I was the faceless, heartless corporation she was complaining about, and I was about to show her exactly how much heart I truly had. Malcolm walked into the VIP suite and checked his watch. "The board of directors is ready for you, Roland," he said softly. "The media is waiting. The city is waiting. And your daughter-in-law is currently standing by the stage telling the mayor that you belong in a nursing home." I adjusted the sleeves of my tuxedo. I felt the weight of my mother's gold wedding ring, which I kept in my vest pocket for luck. I told Malcolm it was time to end the play. I walked out of the suite and toward the service elevator that led to the backstage area. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, the same energy I felt 40 years ago when I bought my first truck. I was not just a father anymore. I was not a freeloader. I was the architect of the reality Harper was currently standing in. The house lights in the grand ballroom began to dim. The thousands of wealthy guests stopped their conversations and turned toward the massive stage. A spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a podium embossed with the gold Vanguard Holdings crest. A deep, professional voice boomed over the high-end speakers, announcing that the moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. The announcer spoke about Vision Legacy and the man who had turned a single truck into a global empire. He called for the room to welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. Harper felt a surge of excitement. She pushed her way through the crowd, using her elbows to get to the very front row. She stood right against the edge of the stage, smoothing her emerald dress and tossing her hair. She made sure she was directly in the center of the spotlight's path. She put on her most dazzling, innocent smile, the one she had used to manipulate Andre for 5 years. She believed this was her moment of salvation. She believed that when this billionaire saw her, he would be captivated. She was ready to play her part to perfection. She was ready to meet the man who held her destiny in his hands. She had no idea that the man she was waiting for was the same man whose boots she had kicked into the mud. The silence in the room was absolute as the heavy velvet curtains began to part. The heavy velvet curtains parted with a slow and silent grace that only $10 million in annual maintenance could buy. I stepped out from the darkness of the wings and into the blinding white heat of the center stage spotlight. The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and the expensive musk of the city's elite. For a heartbeat, the room was absolutely silent as the thousands of guests processed the man standing before them. I was not the broken old man they expected to see. I was not a ghost. I was wearing a custom midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than most luxury cars. Every line of the silk was tailored to perfection, hugging my shoulders and giving me the silhouette of a king. My silver hair was neatly trimmed, and my jaw was set with the hardness of a man who had spent 40 years carving a path through solid stone. Then the applause hit me. It was not a polite clap. It was a roar of respect and recognition that shook the very foundations of the hotel. These were the most powerful people in the state, the movers and the shakers, and they were all standing on their feet for me. I stood there letting the sound wash over me, feeling the cool weight of my mother's gold ring in my vest pocket. I had spent my entire life preparing for this exact moment. In the very front row, standing right against the edge of the stage, was Harper. I watched the exact second her world turned into a nightmare. Her dazzling, manipulative smile did not just fade, it evaporated. Her skin turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray, making the emerald green of her dress look like a funeral shroud. Her eyes, which had been full of greedy anticipation just moments ago, were now wide with a terror so profound it looked like she had seen a demon. Her hands began to tremble so violently that her crystal champagne glass slipped through her fingers. It hit the marble floor at her feet and shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, the sound cutting through the applause like a gunshot. She did not even look down at the glass. She could not move. She could not breathe. She just stared up at me, the freeloader she had kicked into the mud, and realized she was standing in the presence of the man who held her entire life in his hands. I did not smile at her. I did not acknowledge her existence with a nod. I walked slowly to the podium, my leather shoes silent on the stage carpet. I adjusted the microphone, the feedback creating a sharp ring that silenced the room instantly. I looked out over the sea of faces, but my gaze kept returning to the woman in the green dress. "Good evening," I said, My voice was deep, resonant, and carried the weight of every mile I had ever driven and every pallet I had ever loaded. It filled the ballroom, amplified by $1 million worth of audio engineering. We are here to celebrate 40 years of Vanguard Holdings. We are here to celebrate the legacy of a company built on sweat steel and an uncompromising commitment to the truth. I paused, letting the silence settle over the crowd. I could see Harper leaning against the stage for support, her knees buckling. When I started this company in 1984, I did not do it for the money, I continued, my voice growing colder. I did it for a much simpler reason. I grew up in a world where people like me were invisible. I grew up in a world where my mother died because she was treated like a burden instead of a human being. I built this empire to ensure that no one would ever be allowed to look down on me again. I built a mountain so high that the people who wanted to spit on me would have to look up until their necks broke just to see my face. I looked directly down at Harper. The people in the front row began to notice the intensity of my gaze. They started whispering, looking back and forth between the billionaire on the stage and the trembling woman in the green dress. Success is not just about profit margins and logistics networks, I said, leaning into the podium. It is about the integrity of the foundation. In the warehouse business, we have a term called the rot. If you have a single crate of spoiled fruit in a shipment, you do not try to fix the fruit. You do not negotiate with the mold. You cut it out. You throw it into the trash before it infects the rest of the inventory. You protect the integrity of the whole by removing the poison of the parts. I saw a single tear of pure panic roll down Harper's cheek. She was trapped. She could not run away because the crowd was packed tightly around her. She was forced to listen as I dismantled her entire character in front of everyone she had ever tried to impress. The same rule applies to life, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that still echoed in every corner of the room. There are people in this world who believe that wealth is a right instead of a result. There are parasites who think they can kick the very boots that provided their dinner and still expect to sit at the table. They look at a man and see a source of income. They look at a father and see a freeloader. They think their designer dresses and their country club memberships make them superior to the men who actually do the work. But the truth is a patient hunter. It does not yell. It does not argue. It just waits for the lights to come on. I stepped back from the podium, the silence in the room so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of the lungs of everyone present. I had spent 40 years making sure no one could look down on me, and today, as I stood on this stage, the people who had treated me like garbage were literally standing below me. I was the king of this mountain, and I had just declared a moral audit on every person who had ever doubted my worth. Harper tried to speak. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked around the room, realizing that the people she had just been gossiping with were now staring at her with suspicion. She was no longer a victim. She was the rot I was talking about. She was the poison that had been identified and marked for removal. I looked toward the side of the ballroom. Malcolm was standing there, his arms crossed, watching the scene with a look of grim satisfaction. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod to a group of men standing near the exit. These were not the hotel security guards. These were the Vanguard Guardians, my private corporate security team men who had been with me for decades. They moved through the crowd with the silent efficiency of predators, their eyes fixed on the woman in the green dress. I leaned back into the microphone for one final sentence. Tonight we do not just celebrate 40 years of growth, I said. We celebrate the cleaning of the house. We celebrate the moment the freeloader stops paying for the lies of the ungrateful. Enjoy the evening, everyone. I turned and walked away from the podium, heading toward the back of the stage. Behind me, the room erupted into a confused mixture of applause and frantic whispering. I did not look back. I did not need to see the final act. Down on the floor, two of my security guards quietly approached Harper. They did not cause a scene. They did not use handcuffs. They simply stepped on either side of her and placed their hands firmly on her elbows. Harper tried to pull away her face, twisting into a mask of frantic desperation, but the men did not move. They leaned in and whispered something into her ear, something that made her entire body go limp. They began to lead her through the crowd. The city's elite parted like the Red Sea, pulling back their expensive silk and fur coats as she passed as if her very presence was contagious. They watched in absolute silence as the woman who had spent all night claiming to be a victim of corporate bullying was branded a trespasser and escorted out of the most exclusive event of the year. She was being removed from the house I built in front of every person she had ever lied to. I walked into the quiet of the backstage area, the roar of the crowd fading behind the heavy soundproof doors. I sat down in a simple folding chair and took a long, deep breath. I reached into my vest pocket and pulled out my mother's gold ring. I looked at it in the dim light of the rafters. "You were wrong, Mama," I whispered to the empty room. "They did see us, and they will never forget what they saw today." The first part of the war was over. The social execution of Harper was complete. But my son was still out there sitting in a dark mansion waiting for a savior who was never coming home. And tomorrow morning, the real work would begin. I was going to teach Andre what it actually felt like to wear the boots he had allowed his wife to throw away. The transition from prince to pauper was about to be finalized, and I was going to make sure he felt every single step of the fall. Andre sat in the pitch-black living room of the mansion he no longer owned, the only light coming from the flickering glow of the 65-inch television screen. The air in the house was already starting to feel cold and stale, like a tomb that had been sealed before the body was even cold. He was clutching a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey he had found in the back of the pantry, a far cry from the vintage Cabernet he had been sipping just 48 hours ago. He was waiting for Harper to call him back, waiting for her parents to fix everything, waiting for the universe to realize it had made a mistake. Then the local news broadcast cut to a breaking story about the Vanguard Holdings anniversary gala. The screen filled with the image of a man stepping out from behind velvet curtains. Andre frozen the bottle, slipping slightly in his grip. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he squinted at the high-definition display. The man on the screen was tall, powerful, and radiating an almost terrifying level of authority. He was wearing a tuxedo that cost more than Andre's annual mortgage payments. He was being cheered by the most powerful people in the city. And that man was me. Andre watched in absolute paralyzed silence as I delivered my speech about cutting out the rot. He watched as the news anchor described me as one of the wealthiest and most influential logistics magnates in the country, a reclusive billionaire who had kept his true identity a secret for decades. The realization did not hit him slowly. It hit him like a high-speed freight train crashing into a brick wall. The freeloader. The old man who took up too much space. The retired mechanic who was a burden on his perfect life. That man was actually the architect of the entire world Andre lived in. My son let out a choked, jagged sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. He realized with a sickening thud in his chest that when his wife had kicked my boots into the rain, she hadn't just insulted a helpless old man. She had declared war on the sun while standing in the middle of a desert. Panic, raw and cold, finally replaced his shock. Andre scrambled off the sofa, knocking over the whiskey bottle and ignoring the brown liquid as it soaked into the expensive white rug. He didn't care about the rug anymore. He didn't care about Harper. He only cared about survival. He grabbed his car keys and ran out of the house, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't even bother to lock the front door. He scrambled into his German sports car, the one that Vanguard Holdings technically owned, and tore out of the driveway. He knew exactly where he was going. He had found a discarded envelope in my guest room weeks ago with an address he had never recognized. At the time, he thought I was just doing odd jobs for a wealthy family. Now he knew that address was my actual home. He drove like a madman through the city, weaving through traffic and ignoring red lights. The sky opened up, a torrential downpour drenching the city, but Andre didn't slow down. He pushed the car to its limits, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep the vehicle on the road. He finally reached the outskirts of the most exclusive neighborhood in the state, a place where the houses were hidden behind 10-foot stone walls and ancient oak trees. He pulled up to a massive set of wrought-iron gates reinforced with blackened steel. Behind the gates sat a sprawling $15 million estate, a masterpiece of modern architecture, and glass glowing like a fortress on top of a hill. This was my real home. This was the place I went to when I wanted to escape the noise of the world I had built. Andre slammed on the brakes and stumbled out of his car. Within seconds, he was soaked to the bone, his expensive suit clinging to his frame like a second skin. He ran to the heavy metal intercom box mounted on a stone pillar. He smashed his fist against the call button over and over again, his face a mask of desperation and terror. "Dad!" he screamed into the tiny speaker, his voice cracking and competing with the roar of the rain. "Dad, please open the gate. It is me. It is Andre. I am so sorry. I didn't know. Please, you have to help me. Everything is falling apart." I was sitting in my private study surrounded by walls of leather-bound books and the quiet hum of high-end security monitors. I wasn't looking at a book. I was staring at the large screen on my desk, which showed a high-definition night vision feed of my son standing at my gate. He looked pathetic. He looked like a drowned rat begging for a crumb. He was crying now, actual tears mixing with the rainwater running down his face. He started babbling into the intercom, playing the victim, telling me that Harper had forced him to be cruel, that he had been under so much stress with the startup that he never meant the things he said. He was trying to use the same emotional manipulation that had worked on me for 30 years. I leaned back in my chair, watching him through the lens of the camera. I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest that had nothing to do with anger. My mind drifted back to a hospital room in 1998. I remembered the exact moment the nurse had placed a tiny, warm bundle into my arms. Andre had been so small, so fragile. I remember looking down at his tiny face and making a silent, solemn promise to God and to my late wife. I promised that this boy would never know the cold. I promised he would never have to work until his hands bled. I promised that I would build a fortress around him so thick that the world could never hurt him. I kept that promise. I gave him everything. I gave him private tutors, luxury cars, elite vacations, and a limitless safety net. And as I watched him weeping at my gate, I realized with a devastating clarity that my love had been his undoing. By giving him everything, I had deprived him of the only thing that actually makes a man. I had deprived him of the struggle. I had shielded him from the consequences of his own character. And in doing so, I had raised a person who believed that the world was an ATM and I was the card. I realized that the freeloader comment he had allowed his wife to scream at me wasn't just an insult. It was a reflection of his own soul. He was the freeloader. He had spent his entire life consuming the light I produced without ever learning how to strike a match of his own. I reached out and touched the screen, tracing the image of his face. I still loved him. That was the curse of being a father. But I finally understood that the greatest act of love I could perform right now was not to open the door and invite him back into the warmth. The greatest act of love was to let him stay out in the rain until he understood the value of a roof. "Dad, please." Andre wailed, his knees hitting the wet pavement. "I have nowhere else to go. They are going to take the car. They are going to take the house. I have no money. I am your son. You can't do this to your own blood. Please just let me in and we can talk. I will do anything." I stayed silent. I watched him for another 10 minutes as his cries turned into exhausted whimpers. He looked at the camera lens, his eyes pleading, hoping for a sign of weakness. He thought that if he stayed there long enough, my fatherly instincts would kick in, and I would come running out with a warm blanket and a checkbook. He was waiting for the version of me he had bullied and ignored for years. He didn't realize that man had died the moment my boots hit the mud. Finally, I pressed a button on my desk. A loud mechanical buzzer echoed through the rainy night. The massive wrought iron gates began to groan, slowly sliding open on their heavy tracks. Andre's face lit up with a surge of pure, undeserved relief. He scrambled to his feet, wiping the mud from his trousers, a small, triumphant smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He thought he had won. He thought the old man had finally folded. He started walking up the long, winding driveway toward the house, his pace quickening as he pictured a hot shower and a glass of expensive brandy. He reached the top of the hill where the front door of the mansion stood, framed by two massive stone pillars. The door didn't open. Instead, a figure stepped out from the side of the house, illuminated by the bright security floodlights. It wasn't me. It was Malcolm. Malcolm was standing perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of professional indifference. He didn't have a blanket. He didn't have an apology. He was holding a single piece of paper in his right hand, protected from the rain by a clear plastic sleeve. Andre stopped in his tracks, his heart sinking back into his stomach. "Where is my father?" he stammered, his voice trembling with a new kind of fear. "Mr. Rowland is occupied," Malcolm said, his voice flat and cold. "He has no interest in seeing you. However, he did instruct me to deliver this to you before you leave the property." Andre reached out and took the paper with a shaking hand. He looked down at it, expecting a bank transfer or a letter of forgiveness. But as his eyes scanned the text, his knees gave out again. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a way back in. It was a final cold and absolute accounting of his worth. And as the rain continued to pour down, Andre finally realized that the gates hadn't opened to let him in. They had opened to show him exactly what he had lost forever. Andre stood in the pouring rain, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled in its plastic sleeve. He expected mercy. He expected a signature on a check that would make the police and the creditors go away. He expected his father to finally break to show that soft side that had bailed him out a dozen times before. Instead, he stared at a document titled Final Statement of Accounts. It was not a gift. It was a bill. Row after row of numbers stared back at him, neatly categorized and perfectly calculated. $4,512,000. That was the price of his life. Andre blinked against the rain, trying to make sense of the figures. There were the failed startups. There were the luxury car leases. There were the credit card balances for Harper's designer handbags and those 5-star vacations to the Amalfi Coast. Every single dime he thought he had earned through his own talent was listed right there as a debt to Vanguard Holdings. The massive front door of the estate finally opened. I stepped out onto the porch, but I did not walk down the steps to meet him. I stayed under the cover of the stone archway, out of the reach of the storm. I was no longer wearing the $10,000 tuxedo. I had changed into a simple dark sweater and a pair of trousers. I looked like the man Andre thought was a broke retired mechanic, but the way the security lights hit my face made me look like a judge. Andre let out a choked sob and ran toward me. He reached out his arms, intending to throw himself into a hug to play on my emotions one last time. He wanted to feel the warmth of a father's forgiveness. I took a single step back. My movement was cold and deliberate. I did not raise my hand to stop him. I simply removed myself from his reach. Andre stumbled, his arms closing on empty air. He looked up at me, his eyes red and his face smeared with mud and tears. "Dad, please," he whispered. "You have to stop this. I am your son. I am your only son. You cannot hold this over me. It was just a mistake. Harper was the one who pushed it too far. I did not mean what I said." I looked down at him, my expression as flat as a desert floor. "You called me a freeloader, Andre. Those were the words you and your wife used while you sat in a house I paid for. You watched her kick my boots into the mud. You watched her humiliate the man who gave you every breath of your successful life. And you did not say a word. You just took another sip of your wine. That wine is on page 3 of that bill, by the way. $240 a bottle. You have consumed over $50,000 in luxury spirits over the last 3 years alone. All of it was on my tab, So let us look at that paper in your hand and have a reality check. Let us see who the real freeloader is." Andre looked back down at the itemized list, his breath hitching in his chest. "But this is impossible," he stammered. "I am a tech founder. I have a startup. I have an Ivy League education. I am not some charity case. I am a professional. A professional." What I asked, my voice cutting through the sound of the rain. A professional at spending a black man's hard-earned legacy. You think your education makes you superior. You look down on the men who load my trucks. You look down on the mechanics who keep my fleet running. You think you are a genius because you have a degree from a university that charges $70,000 a year. You have spent 10 years telling me how smart you are and how the old world of logistics is dying. You told me I did not understand the new economy. I walked to the edge of the porch, the light catching the gray in my hair. Well, here is a lesson in the new economy, Andre. You did not get into that university because of your brilliant mind. I saw your high school transcripts. I saw the mediocre grades and the teachers' comments about your lack of effort. Your application was headed straight for the rejection pile. But then Vanguard Holdings made a $10 million donation to build a new library wing on that campus. I put a gold plaque on the wall with our family name on it, just so the dean would overlook your test scores. You did not earn your way into that world. I bought it for you. Every lecture you attended and every networking event you bragged about was a gift from the man you called a burden. Your entire identity is a subsidized illusion. You are not a genius. You are just a very expensive mistake that I am finally stopped funding. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. Andre looked like he had been struck physically. The pride he had carried like armor for his entire adult life was shattered. He realized in that moment that every achievement he boasted about was a lie. He was not a self-made man, he was a marionette whose strings had just been cut. He looked down at the $4.5 million total and finally understood that he was not just bankrupt financially. He was bankrupt as a human being. He had nothing. No career, no money, no wife, and now no father. I reached into my pocket and pulled out 2 sets of documents. I held them out toward him, but I did not move toward the rain. He had to come to me. Andre crawled up the stone steps, his movements slow and broken. He reached the edge of the porch and looked at the papers in my hand. "I have 2 paths for you, Andre," I said. "I am no longer your father. As of this moment, I am your primary creditor. Choice number 1 is simple. You sign this petition for voluntary personal bankruptcy. You walk back down those steps and you leave this property. You will lose the car, you will lose the clothes, you will lose the last shred of your reputation. You will go to a homeless shelter and you will start from absolute zero in the city that now knows you are a fraud. I will never speak to you again, and you will never see a cent of my $100 million estate. You can be the freeloader you accuse me of being. You can live on the charity of strangers." Andre flinched his eyes wide with horror. "And the second choice," he whispered. "The second choice is a work contract," I replied. "You will not be a vice president. You will not be a consultant. You will be an entry-level employee at my oldest warehouse facility on the south side. You will work the night shift. You will load crates. You will sweat. You will take orders from men you used to look down on. Your salary will be $18 an hour. $10 of that salary will go directly back to Vanguard Holdings every week to pay off the interest on your debt. You will live in a 1-bedroom apartment that I own, and you will pay rent like every other working man in this city. You will work until you have earned back the respect you threw away. You will learn what it feels like to wear the boots you allowed your wife to kick into the rain." I dropped the 2 documents onto the wet stone at his feet. "Decide now, Andre. The gates are closing in 60 seconds. You can go out into the world as a broken prince, or you can stay and learn how to become a man. But choose carefully, because if you sign that work contract and you fail me one more time, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your life in a prison cell for the embezzlement Malcolm discovered." Andre looked at the 2 papers. He looked out at the dark, freezing street beyond the gates, and then he looked up at the massive, glowing mansion behind me. He saw the cold, hard truth in my eyes. He realized that the man standing before him was not the soft father he could manipulate. He was the founder of an empire, and he was conducting his final audit. With a trembling hand, Andre reached for the pen I held out. He did not look at the bankruptcy papers. He grabbed the work contract. He signed his name at the bottom, his tears smearing the ink. "Good," I said, taking the paper back. "Malcolm will be here at 5 in the morning to take you to the warehouse. Do not be late. If you are even 1 minute behind schedule, the deal is off and the police will be waiting. Now go to the guest house. There is a cot and a blanket, nothing else." I turned around and walked back into my house, closing the heavy oak door behind me. I did not look back to see if he was following. I went to my study and sat in the dark, listening to the rain. My heart was heavy, but my mind was clear. The surgery was brutal, but the rot had to be removed. I had given my son everything, and it had nearly destroyed him. Now I was giving him nothing, and it was the only thing that could save his soul. The prince was dead. Tomorrow, the worker would be born. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt like I was actually being a father. I sat in the back of the family courtroom, blending into the shadows with my cap pulled low. I did not want to be a distraction, but I needed to see this final act of desperation with my own eyes. Harper was no longer the shimmering queen of the country club. She sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a black dress that she probably thought looked modest and mournful, but to me it just looked like a costume. Her parents, Richard and Susan, were squeezed into the row behind her, looking haggard and defeated. They were living in a 2-star motel on the outskirts of the city, sharing a cramped room with a buzzing neon sign and the smell of industrial cleaner. Richard's expensive silver Mercedes had been seized, and Susan was forced to sell her diamond tennis bracelet just to pay for a cut-rate lawyer who smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Harper had filed a massive lawsuit against my son Andre. She was not just asking for a simple divorce. She was demanding a massive monthly alimony payment and, most outrageously, a legal claim to 50% of Andre's future inheritance. She argued in her filing that she had spent 5 years as a dutiful wife supporting Andre's career and building his social standing, and therefore she was entitled to the wealth that would eventually come his way. She was still convinced that I was just a senile old man who would eventually die and leave everything to my only son. She did not realize that a future inheritance is not a legal asset, especially when the person who owns the money is still alive and very, very disappointed. Andre sat at the defense table looking exhausted but strangely calm. He was wearing his warehouse uniform under a cheap jacket, his hands still stained with the dark grease of the loading docks. He did not look at Harper. He did not look at her parents. He just stared straight ahead at the American flag behind the judge's bench. He had spent the last 2 weeks waking up at 4 in the morning to load frozen freight, and the physical labor was starting to strip away the layers of his unearned arrogance. He looked more like my son today than he had in 20 years. Harper's lawyer stood up and began a long, whining opening statement. He spoke about the luxury Harper had grown accustomed to. He talked about the emotional trauma of being evicted from her home and the sudden, heartless withdrawal of financial support. He tried to paint Andre as a secretive, manipulative man who had hidden the family's true wealth to punish his wife. Harper let out a soft, practiced sob into a lace handkerchief, casting a quick glance at the judge to see if the performance was working. She was playing the role of the discarded high society wife to perfection, hoping the judge would see her as a victim of a wealthy man's cruelty. When it was time for the defense to speak, my lead attorney, Diane, stood up. Diane had been with Vanguard Holdings for 30 years. She was a woman who spoke in a voice that was as sharp as a diamond and twice as hard. She did not bother with long speeches about emotions. She simply opened a thick black leather folder and began to lay out the evidence of who Harper truly was. As Diane spoke, my mind drifted back to 1982. I remembered a woman named Sarah, my late wife and Andre's mother. Sarah did not have designer dresses or a country club membership. She had a pair of denim overalls and a heart made of solid gold. I remembered one winter night when my only truck had broken down in the middle of a blizzard. Sarah did not complain. She put on 3 layers of coats and came out to the driveway with me holding a flashlight with her frozen hands while I crawled under the chassis to fix the fuel line. She worked 2 jobs as a nurse's assistant just to make sure we could pay the insurance on the warehouse. She was my partner, my spine, and the reason Vanguard Holdings ever made its first million. She never asked me for a cent. She only asked me to stay safe and come home to her. Harper was the absolute antithesis of everything I respected in a woman. She was a hollow shell filled with nothing but greed and entitlement. She had never loaded a truck. She had never sacrificed a single hour of her comfort for anyone else. And as Diane began to present the findings of our private investigation, the room became deathly silent. Diane started with the financial fraud. We had discovered that over the last 18 months, Harper had been using her access to the corporate credit cards to make secret cash advances. She had set up a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands, slowly siphoning away nearly $200,000 of Vanguard money. She was preparing for a life without Andre long before I ever stepped in. She had been stealing from the very hand that fed her, assuming no one would ever notice the small, steady leaks in the massive corporate ocean. Harper's face turned a dusty shade of white. She tried to whisper to her lawyer, her hands shaking, but Diane was just getting started. Next came the adultery. I had hired a security team months ago to keep an eye on the mansion, mostly to protect the Vanguard assets, but they had caught far more than property maintenance. Diane placed a stack of high-resolution photographs on the judge's bench. They showed Harper in various intimate settings with a man who was not my son. Sometimes it was at a boutique hotel downtown. Sometimes it was in the back of a luxury car parked in a dark corner of the country club. The man was a disgraced tennis professional who had been fired for stealing from his clients. Harper had been funding his lifestyle with my money laughing behind Andre's back while she played the role of the perfect socialite wife. Andre did not flinch when the photos were mentioned. He had already seen them. I had shown him the truth the night he signed the work contract. He had sat in my study and watched his entire marriage turn into a cheap, dirty lie. That was the moment his heart finally hardened against her. The judge, a stern woman with gray hair and eyes that looked like they had seen every trick in the book, leaned forward and studied the photographs. She looked at the bank records. She looked at the evidence of the secret offshore account. The silence in the courtroom was so heavy you could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Harper's parents looked like they wanted to disappear into the floorboards. Richard bowed his head, his face red with shame, finally realizing that his daughter was not the victim she claimed to be. Diane finished her presentation with one final devastating point. She reminded the court that Andre had no personal assets. He had signed over his startup, his car, and his future earnings to Vanguard Holdings to settle his massive corporate debts. He was currently earning $18 an hour loading trucks. There was no inheritance to claim because I was still alive and well, and I had legally removed Andre from my will until further notice. Under the law, you cannot sue a man for money he does not have, and you certainly cannot sue for money that belongs to a father who has no legal obligation to support a daughter-in-law who had cheated on his son and stolen from his company. Harper's lawyer tried to object, but his voice was weak and lacked conviction. He knew the case was dead. He looked at Harper with a mixture of annoyance and pity, realizing he would likely never be paid for his time. The judge took a deep breath and looked directly at Harper. Her voice was cold and echoed through the room. Mr. Rowland built an empire through decades of labor and integrity, the judge said. You treated his son like an ATM and his generosity like a weakness. You engaged in systematic financial fraud and blatant infidelity while demanding the court grant you a life of luxury you never earned. This is not a court of public opinion, and I will not allow you to use the legal system to extort a man who is currently working an honest job to pay his debts. The judge slammed her gavel down with a sound that felt like a final nail in a coffin. The petition for alimony is denied, the judge barked. The claim to any future inheritance is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, due to the frivolous and fraudulent nature of this filing, the plaintiff is ordered to pay all of the defendant's legal fees and court costs immediately. Harper let out a high-pitched, strangled cry. She looked at her parents, but they would not meet her eyes. She looked at Andre, but he was already standing up, buttoning his jacket, ready to head back to the warehouse for his evening shift. He did not give her a second glance. He walked out of the courtroom with his head held high, his back straight, and his dignity finally intact. Harper was left sitting at the table completely alone. She had absolutely nothing. The emerald green dress was gone. The country club was gone. The bank accounts were empty. Even her parents, who had enabled her entitlement for years, walked out of the room without saying a word to her. They were headed back to their motel room to figure out how they were going to survive the federal fraud investigation. I stood up and adjusted my cap. I followed my son out of the courthouse, staying far enough behind that he did not see me. I watched him walk to a bus stop, sit down on the bench, and check his watch. He looked tired, but he looked like a man. The poison had been drained from his life, and the woman who had tried to destroy us was now a ghost in her own story. I got into my car and told my driver to take me to the warehouse. I wanted to see my son work. I wanted to see him build his own life brick by brick, just like I had done 40 years ago. The war was far from over, but for the first time in a very long time, I knew we were going to win. At exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning, my son, Andre, stepped out of a rideshare vehicle in front of the Vanguard Holdings World Headquarters. He was wearing his last clean navy blue Italian suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie that cost more than most families spend on groceries in a month. He had spent an hour in front of the guest house mirror trying to arrange his face into an expression of professional humility. He walked through those massive revolving doors with his chin held high and his shoulders back, trying to reclaim the arrogant swagger of a tech visionary. I watched him through the security monitors in my private office upstairs. I could see the way he looked around the marble lobby, as if he were simply returning to his rightful place after a brief and unfortunate vacation. He probably believed that the work contract he had signed was just a sophisticated legal formality. He likely convinced himself that I was simply testing his resolve, and that by the end of the day he would be sitting in a corner office with a title like Special Consultant or Director of Strategic Initiatives. He expected a high-end laptop, a dedicated parking space, and a secretary who would bring him hot coffee in a ceramic mug. Andre walked up to the reception desk and gave his name with a practiced smile. He told the young woman behind the counter that he was there to report for his first day of work. He expected her to stand up and welcome him back. He expected her to call a senior vice president to escort him to the executive elevators. Instead, the receptionist did not even look up from her computer screen. She reached into a drawer, pulled out a visitor badge, and told him to wait in the seating area. Andre's smile faltered. He sat on the edge of a stiff leather chair for 20 minutes, his eyes darting toward the elevators every time they opened. He was starting to get agitated, checking his diamond watch, and adjusted his cufflinks. He still did not understand that the man he was today had no connection to the boy I had raised in a mansion. A heavy-set man named Big Mike walked into the lobby. Mike had been my director of ground operations for 30 years. He was a man with skin the color of dark mahogany and hands that looked like they had been carved out of solid oak. Mike was a veteran of the loading docks, a man who had earned his position through 40,000 hours of manual labor and zero excuses. When Mike saw Andre standing there in a $1,000 suit, he did not offer a handshake. He did not call him Mr. Andre. He let out a deep, rumbling laugh that echoed off the polished stone walls of the lobby. The sound of that laughter made Andre's face turn a bright shade of embarrassed red. "You must be the new hire," Mike said, his voice like gravel grinding together. "Follow me." Andre followed Mike not toward the executive elevators, but toward a service door near the back of the building. They walked into a cramped, windowless room that smelled of industrial floor wax and old coffee. Mike reached onto a metal shelf and pulled out a heavy plastic bag. He tossed it onto a small table in front of Andre. Inside was a bright neon yellow high-visibility vest, a pair of thick gray industrial gloves, and a pair of heavy black leather boots with reinforced steel toes. Andre stared at the items as if they were radioactive. He looked at his tailored suit and then looked at Mike, his eyes wide with confusion. "I think there is a misunderstanding," Andre stammered. "I signed a contract to work for the company. I have a degree from an Ivy League university. I was expecting to be placed in the logistics planning department, or perhaps the legal audit team." Mike leaned over the table, his massive presence filling the small room. "You are exactly where the boss wants you," he said. "Your Ivy League degree does not mean a thing in a refrigerated trailer. This is not a country club, Andre. This is a warehouse. Now take off that pretty suit and put on the gear. The transport van leaves in 10 minutes. If you are not in it, you are fired before you even start." Andre stood in the small restroom, changing out of his designer clothes. He folded his silk tie and placed it neatly in his bag, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. He pulled on the heavy work trousers and the stiff steel-toed boots. The boots were heavy and uncomfortable, clunking against the tile floor. He put on the neon vest and looked at himself in the mirror. The man looking back at him was no longer a prince. He looked like a common laborer, a nobody in a city of millions. He walked back out to the van, feeling the weight of the boots with every step. The transport van drove 20 miles south, deep into the industrial heart of the city. They pulled up to warehouse number 1. It was a squat, ugly concrete building that took up an entire city block, surrounded by chain-link fences and coils of rusted barbed wire. This building was the beating heart of my empire, but it was also a place of ghosts. This was the exact warehouse where I started Vanguard Holdings 45 years ago. I remember every crack in that concrete floor. I remember the exact spot where I used to sit and eat a cold sandwich at midnight because I could not afford to turn on the heat in my tiny office. I spent 5 years working the night shift in this building from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning. I did not have a car back then. I walked 4 miles each way in the freezing Chicago wind, often with holes in my shoes and a prayer in my heart. I did it because I had a vision of a future where my son would never have to know the meaning of the word hunger. Now, after 40 years of providing him with every luxury imaginable, my son was standing on that same cracked floor, shivering in the cold. The manager of the facility was a man named Silas. He had worked for me since the beginning, and he knew exactly why Andre was there. He did not give Andre a tour. He did not introduce him to the team. He simply pointed toward a massive 40-foot refrigerated trailer that was backed up to the loading dock. A thick white fog of sub-zero air rolled out from the back of the truck. "Your job is loading frozen poultry crates," Silas said, handing Andre a heavy clipboard. "The trailer is at 10 degrees below zero. You load them from the floor to the ceiling. No gaps, no leaning stacks. If a single crate falls, the whole load is ruined and the cost comes out of your check. You get $18 an hour. 10 of that goes to the debt. You get one 15-minute break at midnight. Get to work." Andre stepped into the back of the trailer. The cold was a physical blow. It was a dry, biting cold that immediately sucked the warmth from his skin and settled deep into his marrow. He grabbed the first 40-pound crate of frozen chicken. It was heavy and the cardboard was slick with frost. He struggled to lift it, feeling the muscles in his lower back protest. He shoved the box into the corner and reached for the next one. By the second hour, his breathing was heavy and ragged. His lungs felt like they were being scraped by sandpaper from the freezing air. He was used to sitting in climate-controlled offices and eating catered lunches. He had never used his body for anything more strenuous than a tennis match or a golf swing. The other men on the loading dock were mostly younger than him. They were strong, hardened by years of physical labor. They moved with a rhythmic efficiency that made Andre look like a clumsy child. They did not talk to him. They did not offer to help him with the heavy crates. They had seen the news reports of the billionaire's son who had been humbled by his father. They watched him struggle with a quiet, hard satisfaction in their eyes. Every time Andre stumbled or dropped a box, they simply looked away, their silence louder than any insult. By midnight, Andre was a ghost. His hair was matted with sweat and frost. The neon vest was covered in grime and the smell of raw frozen meat. His back was a solid wall of pain and his knees were clicking with every step. But it was his hands that were the worst. Even through the thick industrial gloves, the rough cardboard and the freezing temperature had taken a toll. He pulled off his gloves during his brief break and stared at his palms. The skin was raw and red. Large blisters had formed and several of them had already burst, leaving his hands covered in a mixture of blood and clear fluid. He looked at his hands and started to shake. The reality of the next 20 years flashed before his eyes. He realized that this was not a weekend punishment. This was his life. He sat on a plastic crate in the corner of the loading dock, looking out at the dark, empty street beyond the fence. He thought about his sports car. He thought about Harper. He thought about the silk sheets and the marble floors of his old home. It all felt like a dream from a different life. He felt a surge of pure, white-hot resentment toward me. He wanted to throw the clipboard on the ground and walk out. He wanted to call a cab and disappear to another state. But then he remembered the ironclad work contract. He remembered the federal embezzlement audit sitting in Malcolm's safe. He remembered the judge's face in the courtroom. He was trapped in a cage made of his own arrogance and his own debts. He looked at his bleeding hands and let out a quiet, choked sob. He was a 72-year-old man's son, but he felt like a broken little boy. He realized for the first time just how much effort it had taken for me to build the ladder he had spent his whole life standing on. He had spent his life looking down at men like Silas and Big Mike, never realizing that they were the ones holding up his entire world. Now he was at the bottom of that ladder, and the ground was cold, hard, and unforgiving. Silas walked over and kicked the crate Andre was sitting on. "Break is over, Andre," he said, his voice showing no mercy. "We have 3 more trailers coming in before sunrise. If you are too weak for the work, you can sign the bankruptcy papers and leave. But if you want to eat tomorrow, you get back in that truck." Andre wiped his face with his bloodied hand. He did not say a word. He stood up, his legs trembling, and pulled his gloves back on over his raw skin. He walked back into the freezing fog of the refrigerated trailer and reached for the next crate. The prince was dead and the worker was being born in the dark. He had no idea if he would survive the night, but he knew one thing for certain. The boots were on his feet now, and he was going to have to learn how to walk in them. 3 months of silence between a father and a son can feel like an eternity, or a blink of an eye, depending on which side of the warehouse gate you are standing on. For me, sitting in my quiet study, it was a period of grim observation. For Andre, it was a descent into a reality he had spent 30 years ignoring. Silas sent me a photo of him taken by a security camera in the break room. Andre was leaning against a vending machine, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. He had lost 20 pounds. The soft, pampered padding of his old life had been replaced by lean, hard muscle. His face, which used to be animated by a smug sense of superiority, was now etched with a permanent mask of exhaustion. He looked 40 years older. But more importantly, he looked like a man who was finally starting to understand the gravity of the world. He was no longer a tech visionary or a startup genius. He was a man who knew exactly how much a gallon of milk cost and exactly how many hours of loading crates it took to pay for it. I watched the security footage of his first few weeks with a heart that felt like it had been carved from a block of ice. I saw him trip over his own feet in those heavy steel-toed boots. I saw him accidentally drop a crate of frozen poultry and spend 20 minutes frantically trying to pick up the shattered ice and frozen meat while the other loaders watched him with cold, indifferent eyes. I saw him sit in the corner of the break room eating a peanut butter sandwich he had made himself, his hands shaking from the sheer exhaustion of the labor. My business partner Malcolm told me I was being too hard on him. Malcolm said that 3 months of manual labor was enough to teach any man a lesson and that I should bring him back into the corporate fold before he completely broke. But I told Malcolm that Andre was not being punished. He was being forged. You do not make a sword by talking to the metal. You make it by putting it in the fire and hitting it with a hammer until the impurities are gone. Andre had spent 30 years being soft. He needed to be hard. He needed to know that the world did not care about his feelings, his degree, or his famous last name. The world only cares about what you can produce and how much weight you can carry. The boots were the key. I remember buying those original boots at a surplus store in South Chicago back in 1978. I had exactly $40 in my pocket, and 30 of it went to those boots. They were uncomfortable, and they rubbed my heels raw for a month, but they were the only things protecting me from the jagged metal and the frozen ground of the docks. I kept them polished. I kept them by the door of the small apartment I shared with Sarah. She used to laugh at how much I babied those old boots, but she understood. She knew that as long as I could lace them up, we were going to survive. When Harper threw my current pair into the mud, she was not just being rude. She was trying to discard the very concept of struggle. She wanted the mansion without the warehouse. She wanted the champagne without the sweat. By the end of the 3rd month, Andre had developed a routine. He arrived 15 minutes early for every shift. He cleaned his boots every Sunday afternoon sitting on the porch of his tiny apartment. He was starting to find a quiet dignity in the maintenance of his own life. He was no longer waiting for someone to save him. He was starting to realize that the weight of the boots was not the leather or the steel. The weight was the responsibility. Those original boots I wore were the foundation of every brick and every glass window in the mansion he used to live in. They were the boots of a man who carried the entire future of his family on his back while walking through the snow. They were the boots of a man who refused to break when the world told him he was nothing. He finally understood that the boots Harper threw away were not just old shoes. They were the very reason he had ever been allowed to walk on marble floors in the first place. It was a Tuesday night around 4 a.m. Andre had just finished a grueling double shift because 2 of the regular loaders had called in sick. He was covered in a thin layer of gray dust and the smell of industrial refrigerant. He was driving a 10-year-old battered sedan with a fading paint job and a loud exhaust, a vehicle Malcolm had procured for him to replace the sports car he had forfeited. He pulled into a brightly lit gas station on the edge of the warehouse district to fill up his tank. His hands were stiff, his joints were aching, and he just wanted to go to his 1-bedroom apartment and sleep for 12 hours. The gas station was one of those lonely islands of light in a sea of urban darkness. The air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust and cheap coffee. Andre was exhausted in a way that he had never known before. It was a deep, bone-weary fatigue that made his brain feel heavy and his eyes burn. He stood by the pump, watching the numbers climb slowly, his mind drifting toward the apartment he was renting for $800 a month. It was a small place with a leaking faucet and a drafty window, but it was his. He paid the rent with his own check. He bought his own groceries. He was learning the mathematics of survival. Then a sleek white convertible pulled into the station with its top down and the music blaring. The sound of the engine was a high-pitched scream, a mechanical boast of wealth and power. Andre did not even look up at first. He had seen thousands of Ferraris in his old life. He had owned 2 of them. To him, it was just noise. But the music was loud, a vulgar, bass-heavy track that seemed designed to demand attention. And then he heard the laugh. The woman in the passenger seat was laughing a high-pitched brittle sound that Andre recognized instantly. It was Harper. She was wearing a new fur coat and a pair of diamond earrings that sparkled under the fluorescent gas station lights. She looked exactly the same as the day she walked out of the courtroom, yet she looked like a complete stranger to him. Sitting next to her was a man in his 60s with a fake tan, a head of bleached hair, and a gold watch that was far too large for his wrist. He looked like the kind of man who bought his way into rooms he did not belong in. Harper was leaning toward him, whispering something in his ear. Then she saw Andre. She did not look away. She did not show a hint of shame or regret. Instead, her face twisted into a look of cruel delight. She nudged the older man and pointed her finger at Andre. She stepped out of the car, the high heels clicking against the concrete like a countdown. "Oh my God!" she said, her voice loud enough for the night clerk to hear. "Is that really you, Andre? You look like you just crawled out of a sewer." She walked around his beat-up sedan, her nose wrinkled in disgust. "I cannot believe I used to let you touch me," she sneered. "You actually smell like rotting meat." The older man in the Ferrari did not get out. He just leaned back in his seat and watched his eyes narrowed behind expensive sunglasses. He looked at Andre as if he were a minor inconvenience, a bug on the windshield of his perfect life. "Is this the one you told me about, Harper?" The man asked, his voice deep and bored. "The one who lost everything to his own father?" Harper nodded vigorously, laughing as she leaned against the pump. "Yes," she said. "This is the great genius. Look at his hands. They are disgusting. He is exactly what he always was, a failure." Andre stood there holding the nozzle. He looked at her diamonds and her fur. He looked at the man in the car who was clearly just her latest source of income. And for the first time in his life, Andre did not feel the urge to argue. He did not feel the need to explain himself or prove his worth. For months he had been haunted by the memory of her. He had spent his nights wondering if she ever missed him. He had wondered if she was suffering the way he was. He had even felt a lingering sense of love, a hope that they might one day find each other again if he ever made it back to the top. But as he stood there in his dirty neon vest looking at the woman he had once called his wife, he felt a sudden and overwhelming sense of clarity. He did not see a queen. He did not see a victim. He saw a shallow, desperate parasite who had moved from one host to the next without a second of self-reflection. He saw the emptiness in her eyes, the fake sparkle of the jewelry he knew her new companion had paid for. He looked at the older man in the Ferrari, and he did not feel jealous. He felt pity. He realized that the man in the car was exactly what Andre used to be, a target for a woman who only loved the reflection of her own status in someone else's wallet. Andre realized that the dirt on his own hands was honest. It was his dirt. He had earned the $18 an hour. He had earned the right to stand on his own feet. Harper had not changed. She was still a freeloader. She was still a person who would kick someone's boots into the rain if the wind started blowing the wrong way. The love he had carried for her like a heavy stone for 5 years simply evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hard disgust. He did not yell at her. He did not try to defend himself. He just looked through her as if she were made of glass. He realized that the man in the Ferrari was not a winner. He was just the next victim. Harper would stay with him as long as the accounts were full, and she would disappear the moment the wind changed. Andre finished pumping his gas and hung up the nozzle. He did not say a word to her. He did not even acknowledge the older man's laughter. He simply walked to the window, paid for his gas, and walked back to his car. Harper was still standing there, waiting for a reaction, waiting for him to beg or cry or get angry. But Andre just got into his sedan and started the engine. He did not look at her. He did not look at the Ferrari. He just drove away into the gray light of the early morning. He realized that the humbling was not about the warehouse or the $18 an hour. It was about seeing the world for what it actually was. It was about realizing that a man's worth is not found in what he owns, but in what he is willing to endure. He felt a sense of peace he had never known in his mansion. He was finally awake. I stood by the warehouse entrance as the sun began to rise. I saw Andre's beat-up car pull into the lot. I saw him get out and walk toward me. He did not have the swagger of a prince. He had the steady, determined gait of a worker. He stopped a few feet away from me and nodded. "Good morning," he said. His voice was quiet and steady. I looked at his boots. They were clean and well-oiled. I looked at his hands. They were scarred and hard. I realized that the boy I had raised was finally gone, and the man I had hoped for was finally standing in front of me. I did not offer him a check. I did not offer him his old life back. I just looked at him and gestured toward the door. "You are early," I said. Andre smiled. It was the first real smile I had seen on his face in years. "I have work to do," he replied. And together we walked into the warehouse to start the day. The transition was complete. The prince had truly become the man I knew he could be. The sun was just beginning to peek over the jagged skyline of the industrial district when the heavy steel doors of the warehouse groaned open. Andre was one of the last men to exit the building. He did not have that frantic, desperate energy he carried 3 months ago. He walked with a slow, heavy, and steady rhythm. His neon vest was stained with a mixture of grease and the gray condensation that comes from working inside refrigerated trailers for 12 hours straight. He looked like a man who had spent the entire night wrestling with reality, and for the first time in his life, he looked like he was winning the fight. I was standing by my car, not the armored luxury sedan I usually used for business, but a simple black SUV that did not scream for attention. I saw him spot me from across the parking lot. He did not flinch. He did not run over with his hand out, looking for a handout or a way back into the mansion. He just adjusted the strap of his heavy work bag and walked toward me, his steel-toed boots clumping on the cold asphalt with a sound of solid purpose. When he reached the car, I did not say anything at first. I just reached into the passenger seat and pulled out an old blue thermos. It was the same one I used to take to the docks 40 years ago. I poured a cup of steaming black coffee into the plastic lid and handed it to him. Andre took it with both hands, his fingers scarred and his knuckles swollen from the labor. He did not check the brand of the beans. He did not ask for sugar or organic cream. He just took a long, slow swallow and closed his eyes as the heat hit his throat. He looked at the cup, then looked at me. "Thanks, Dad," he said. His voice was deeper now. It had a certain scratchiness to it that only comes from breathing cold warehouse air and shouting over the roar of diesel engines. It was the voice of a man, not a pampered prince. We sat together on the tailgate of the SUV watching the morning traffic begin to swell on the distant highway. For the first time in 10 years, there was no tension between us. There were no frantic startup pitches. There were no complaints about the quality of the service or the speed of the internet. We were just two men sitting in the silence of a shifting world. Andre told me about the night shift. He spoke about a man named Hector who had shown him how to brace his knees when lifting the 100-pound crates so he would not blow out his back. He talked about the way the frost patterns formed on the inside of the trailers when the temperature dropped below zero. He did not sound like he was complaining. He sounded like a man describing the terrain of a war he was finally learning how to navigate. I listened to him speak, and I felt a strange and profound sense of peace settling over my soul. It was a feeling I had not known since the day my wife Sarah passed away. For years, I had been haunted by the idea that I had failed her. I had built a $100 million empire, but I had allowed our son to become a hollow, arrogant shell of a human being. I used to walk through the gold-leafed hallways of my mansion and feel like a failure because the legacy I was leaving behind was a boy who did not know how to survive a rainy day. But as I sat on that tailgate smelling the diesel and the cheap coffee, I realized that I had not lost a son. I was finally building one. I was taking the raw, broken materials of his character and I was forging them into something that could actually endure the wind. Andre took another sip of the coffee and looked at the warehouse behind us. "I used to think you were being cruel, Dad," he said quietly. "I used to think you were just a bitter old man who wanted to see me suffer because you had a hard life. But last night I was standing in the back of a truck and I realized something. I realized that the only reason I ever felt superior to the men in that building was because I was standing on your shoulders. I was looking down at them while you were the one holding me up. I am sorry I called you a freeloader. I was looking in a mirror and I did not even know it." I placed my hand on his shoulder. It felt different now. The bone was there. The muscle was there. He did not pull away. "Listen to me, Andre," I said, my voice low and steady. "I never told you about the $100 million because money is a dangerous thing for a man who does not know who he is. To a weak man, that kind of wealth is a cage. It makes you lazy. It makes you soft, and it makes you think you are untouchable. But to a real man, that money is a tool. It is a weapon you use to protect your family and build your community. Right now, you are still learning how to hold a hammer. You are not ready for the weapon yet." Andre nodded, his gaze fixed on the rising sun. "I am not asking for the money, Dad. I do not think I want it right now. I like the way my hands feel when they are tired. I like knowing that the rent is paid because I moved 10,000 boxes. I looked at him and I felt a surge of pride that nearly brought tears to my eyes. "That is the most important lesson you will ever learn," I told him. "But you need to understand the new order of this family. You are working for $18 an hour and you will continue to do so. I have placed my entire estate into a locked trust. You will not see a single dime of that $100 million until you earn a management position at Vanguard Holdings on your own merit. No favors, no secret phone calls from me to Silas. You will compete with every other worker in that building. You will show up early, you will stay late, and you will prove to the men on that dock that you are a leader because you can do the work better than anyone else. When the day comes that the board of directors promotes you because they need your brain and your backbone, that is the day you get the keys to the kingdom. Until then, you are just an employee of the man who owns the boots you are wearing. Andre did not complain. He did not beg for a shortcut. He just finished his coffee, handed the cup back to me, and stood up. "I will see you at the warehouse, Dad," he said. He turned and walked toward his beat-up sedan. He did not look back. He drove out of the parking lot, heading toward his small apartment to get 5 hours of sleep before doing it all over again. The months that followed were a masterclass in human transformation. I watched the quarterly reports from warehouse number 1. I did not ask Silas for updates, but I saw the data. Andre's productivity was in the top 5%. He had 0 absences. He had volunteered for every holiday shift and every double load. But more than the numbers, I heard the stories. I heard that he had stayed late to help a new hire learn the logistics software. I heard that he had stood up to a crooked foreman who was trying to short the loaders on their overtime pay. He was not just moving boxes anymore, he was moving people. He was earning the respect of men who had spent their entire lives hating people like him. Exactly 1 year to the day after he signed the work contract, I received a formal memo from the regional director of operations. It was not a request for a favor. It was a recommendation for a promotion. The memo stated that a loader named Andre had demonstrated exceptional leadership qualities and a deep understanding of the warehouse floor operations. They wanted to promote him to shift supervisor. They had no idea he was my son. They just knew he was the best man for the job. That evening I was sitting in my study when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Andre standing there. He was clean and he was wearing a simple button-down shirt and dark trousers. He looked healthy, he looked strong, and his eyes were clear. He did not wait for me to speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped box. "I got my first promotion today, Dad," he said. "I am a supervisor now." I felt a lump in my throat that I could not swallow. "Congratulations, son," I whispered. He held out the box. "I did not use the corporate account for this," he said. "I did not use a credit card. I saved $60 a week for 3 months from my actual take-home pay. I wanted to buy you something with my own sweat." I took the box and opened it slowly. Inside was a simple, classic pocket watch. It was not a Rolex. It was not gold. It was a sturdy stainless steel piece with a clean white face. It was the kind of watch a working man uses to make sure he is never late for his shift. I turned it over and saw the inscription on the back. It read, "To the man who gave me the boots." I looked up at my son, and for the first time in my life, I did not see a project or a disappointment. I saw the legacy I had spent 40 years trying to build. I realized that the house, the trucks, and the $100 million were just things. This man standing in front of me was the real empire. Sarah would have been proud. She would have seen the same fire in his eyes that she saw in mine when we were young and hungry. I put the watch in my pocket and I stepped forward. I did not stay back this time. I reached out and pulled my son into a tight embrace. "Welcome home, Andre," I said. He hugged me back, his grip strong and sure. "I am not coming home, Dad," he said with a quiet laugh. "I have a shift starting at 6 in the morning, and I cannot be late. I just wanted to say thank you for the coffee." I watched him walk down the driveway and get into his car. He was not a prince anymore. He was a man with a watch he had earned and a future he had built with his own hands. The new order was established, and the rot was finally gone. We were no longer a story of betrayal. We were a story of reconstruction. And as I closed the door, I knew that the Vanguard legacy was finally in safe hands. I spent 74 years on this earth, and I have learned that the highest peaks always offer the coldest views. For decades, I believed that the size of my bank account was the only shield I had against a world that wanted to see me fail. I built Vanguard Holdings like a fortress, brick by brick and dollar by dollar, until I was sitting on a $100 million throne. But as I sat in my quiet penthouse on the morning of my 74th birthday, I realized that the most valuable things I owned were not locked in a corporate vault. I turned on the local morning news and saw a face that used to haunt my son's dreams. It was Harper. She was not wearing an emerald green silk dress anymore. She was wearing a cheap gray hoodie with the hood pulled low, but the camera caught her face as she was being led out of a high-end department store in handcuffs. The headline across the bottom of the screen read, "Local socialite caught shoplifting luxury handbags. The news report said she had tried to walk out with 3 Chanel bags hidden in a shopping bag from a discount store. When the security guards stopped her, she had screamed that her father was a powerful developer and that she would have them all fired. But her father was not a developer anymore. Richard was currently standing in aisle 7 of a massive discount retail chain on the north side of the city, wearing a bright blue polyester vest with a name tag that said Associate. He was not signing multi-million-dollar contracts. He was directing customers to the bathroom and apologizing for being out of stock on paper towels. Susan was working in the same store folding T-shirts for $10 an hour, her expensive plastic surgery starting to sag because she could no longer afford the maintenance. The sleazy older man in the white convertible had dumped Harper the moment her father's federal fraud investigation hit the papers. He did not want a partner. He wanted a trophy, and a trophy with a legal bill is just a liability. Harper was a ghost of her former self, a hollow woman trying to steal the status she had once thrown away. I turned off the television and felt a strange sense of closure. It was not joy. I did not find pleasure in their suffering, but I felt a profound sense of justice. The universe was finally balancing the books. They had treated the world like a buffet they could eat from without ever paying the bill, and now the check had finally arrived. I adjusted the sleeves of my shirt and looked at the watch on my left wrist. It was a $50,000 Patek Philippe, a masterpiece of platinum and precision. I had bought it 10 years ago during a week when I was closing a massive deal with a group of European investors. I remember walking into that boardroom and seeing the way they looked at me. They saw a black man in a nice suit, but their eyes were full of a quiet condescension. They thought I was a fluke. They thought I was lucky, so I bought that watch and wore it like a piece of armor. It was a silent signal to the white corporate world that I belonged in the room. It was a way of saying I have more money on my wrist than you have in your retirement fund, so do not speak to me like a child. For a long time, that watch was my pride. It was the ultimate proof that I had won. I left the penthouse and drove myself to a small crowded diner on the edge of the warehouse district. It was a place with cracked vinyl booths, a jukebox that only played old soul records, and the constant smell of burnt coffee and fried onions. I saw Andre sitting in a booth by the window. He was wearing his Vanguard supervisor jacket, and he was scrolling through a logistics report on his phone. He looked tired, but it was a healthy tiredness. He looked like a man who was fully engaged with his life. When he saw me, he stood up and gave me a firm, steady handshake. He did not look for a hug. He did not look for a handout. He just looked me in the eye and told me happy birthday. We ordered breakfast. Andre did not look at the prices. He did not complain that the coffee was not artisanal. He just ate his eggs and told me about the new tracking system he was implementing in the South Side warehouse. He spoke with an authority that was born from experience, not from a degree I had bought for him. He knew exactly how much time was being wasted on the loading docks, and he had a plan to fix it. He sounded like a leader. He sounded like me. After we finished our meal, Andre reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. "I know you can buy anything in the world," Dad Andre said, his voice quiet but clear. "But I wanted to give you this. It is the first thing I have ever bought for you with money I actually earned myself. I saved $60 a week for months. This came out of my actual take-home pay after the rent and the debt payments. I did not use a credit card, and I did not ask Malcolm for a loan. I took the box and opened it. Inside was a simple stainless steel watch. It was a $50 Timex with a brown leather strap. It was the kind of watch a man buys when he needs to know the time but does not care about the status. I looked at the watch and then I looked at my son. I saw the calluses on his fingers. I saw the scar on his knuckle from a crate that had slipped 6 months ago. I realized that this $50 watch was the most expensive gift I had ever received. It was not just a timepiece. It was a receipt. It was the final payment on the debt of his character. It was the proof that I had succeeded as a father. I looked at the $50,000 Patek Philippe on my wrist. I thought about the boardrooms and the investors and the people who had looked down on me. I realized that I did not need that armor anymore. I did not need to prove anything to the world. The only person I ever truly needed to prove my worth to was sitting across from me in this greasy booth. I slowly unbuckled the platinum watch and placed it on the table between us. Then I picked up the $50 watch Andre had bought me. I slid it onto my wrist and buckled the leather strap. It felt light. It felt honest. It felt right. The Patek was bought to prove to the white corporate world that I belonged in their circles. It was a mask I wore to hide the boy from the slums. But this $50 watch proves to me that I succeeded in the one job that actually mattered. I finally raised a man. I looked at Andre, and I saw my late wife Sarah in the way he held his head. I saw the fire and the integrity that had been buried under years of unearned luxury. I realized that I had not just saved his life. I had restored his soul. Andre looked at the platinum watch sitting on the table and then looked at the cheap watch on my wrist. He did not ask why I had made the swap. He did not try to convince me to put the expensive one back on. He just nodded, and a small smile touched the corners of his mouth. He understood. He understood that the transition was finally over. We were no longer a billionaire and his dependent. We were two men who knew the value of a hard day's work and the weight of a family name. The diner was loud and the service was slow, but I have never felt more at peace in my entire life. I looked out the window and saw the Vanguard trucks driving past on the highway. I knew that the empire was safe. My logistics network was growing, my profits were at an all-time high, and my legal team had successfully defended every asset from the vultures. But more importantly, my legacy was finally secure. I was no longer worried about what would happen to the $100 million when I was gone. I knew that the man sitting across from me would protect it not because he wanted the money, but because he respected the work that went into every single cent of it. I left the Patek Philippe on the table for the waitress as a tip. She had been working the double shift, and she had a young son she was trying to put through school. I did not need the money, and the watch belonged in the hands of someone who was still fighting the war. Andre and I walked out of the diner and into the cold morning air. We stood by our cars for a moment. Andre adjusted his supervisor jacket and checked his new watch. "I have a meeting with the night shift foreman in 20 minutes, he said. "I cannot be late." I watched him get into his beat-up sedan and drive away. I stood there for a long time, watching the exhaust from his car disappear into the gray sky. I looked down at the $50 watch on my wrist. It was ticking steadily, a rhythmic reminder of the time we have left and the work that remains to be done. I had survived the betrayal, the humiliation, and the long, cold nights of doubt. I had cut out the rot, and I had saved my son from the very monster I had accidentally created. I looked toward the camera, imagining the millions of people who might be watching my story. I was no longer a freeloader. I was no longer just a retired mechanic. I was the architect of my own destiny, and I had a final message for anyone who thought that respect was something you could buy or inherit. I took a deep breath, felt the cool air in my lungs, and prepared to deliver the final word on the empire of the boots. I am back in my penthouse, sitting in the high back leather chair that overlooks the entire flickering grid of Chicago. At 72 years old, the silence of this room used to feel like a heavy burden, but tonight it feels like a hard-won victory. I look out at the skyscrapers and the winding highways, and I see the veins of the empire I built with my own two hands. For a long time, I thought the most important thing I could leave behind was the money. I thought that $100 million was the ultimate shield I could place between my son and the harshness of the world. I was wrong. Money without character is just a faster way to hit the bottom. I look at the city and I reflect on the brutal but necessary surgery I performed on my own family tree over the last year. I had to cut deep, I had to remove the branches that were soft and entitled, and I had to let the fire of reality burn away the parasites. It was a cold and lonely process, but as I watch the sunrise, I know that the tree is finally healthy again. The rot has been excised, and the roots are finally finding their own strength in the soil. Malcolm walked into the room 10 minutes ago. He did not say a word. He just placed a heavy leather-bound folder on my desk and handed me a gold-plated fountain pen. This is the final version of my will and testament. It is an ironclad legal fortress that took my entire legal team 6 months to construct. I opened the folder and looked at the numbers. $100 million. It is a staggering amount of weight for one man to carry. But the terms of this trust are unlike any other in the history of Vanguard Holdings. There will be no lump sum payments. There will be no multi-million-dollar payouts on his 30th birthday. Andre will only inherit the wealth gradually, and he will have to earn every single penny of it. The trust is set up with a strict matching clause. For every dollar Andre earns through his own salary, his own business ventures, or his own sweat, the trust will release exactly $1 to match it. If he earns $50,000 a year loading trucks, he gets $50,000 from the trust. If he works his way up to an executive position and earns $1 million, he will receive $1 million from the trust. But if he stops working, if he becomes lazy, or if he ever tries to live off the labor of others again, the faucet will turn off instantly and permanently. I am not giving him a fortune. I am giving him a partner that only rewards his own effort. I sign my name at the bottom of the document, the ink drying as a final seal on the new order of our family. I handed the pen back to Malcolm, and he gave me a quiet nod of respect. He knows as well as I do that this is the greatest gift I have ever given my son. It is the gift of a purpose. Andre is no longer a prince waiting for a crown. He is a man who knows that his future is entirely in his own hands. I think about my late wife Sarah as I close the folder. I can almost hear her voice in the quiet of the room telling me that I finally did the right thing. She never wanted Andre to be a spoiled socialite. She wanted him to be a man of integrity, and tonight I can finally look at her photograph without feeling the sting of shame. I did not lose a son through this process. I stripped away the mask of the boy I had accidentally created, and I finally found the man who was hiding underneath. I stood up and walked to the closet. I did not reach for my Tom Ford suit or my expensive Italian loafers. Instead, I reached into the back of the closet and pulled out a pair of old, worn-out leather work boots. These were the boots Harper had kicked into the rain on that cold October night. They were the boots that had been sitting in a muddy puddle while my son watched in silence. I had cleaned them myself. I had oiled the leather until it was soft and supple, and I had replaced the laces with heavy-duty cord. I sat on the edge of my bed and pulled them on. I felt the steel toe and the heavy rubber sole, and I felt a connection to the man I was 40 years ago. These boots are the most honest things I own. They are the foundation of every dollar in that $100 million trust. They are the symbols of a life that refused to be small. I laced them up tightly, feeling the familiar support around my ankles, and I stood up. I felt strong. I felt ready. I left the penthouse and took the elevator down to the garage. I did not call for my driver. I got into my own SUV and drove through the quiet, early morning streets toward the south side. I pulled up to the gates of warehouse number 1 just as the night shift was beginning to wrap up. I saw the massive trailers backed up to the docks, and I heard the familiar mechanical roar of the forklifts. I parked in a corner of the lot and waited. A few minutes later, I saw a group of men walking out of the employee entrance. They were covered in dust, their faces lined with exhaustion, but they were laughing and talking like men who had just survived a battle together. In the center of the group was Andre. He was wearing his supervisor vest and carrying a clipboard. He was talking to Silas, gesturing toward one of the loading bays. He was not looking at his watch or complaining about the cold. He was focused on the work. He was focused on his team. I watched him shake hands with the men as they headed toward their cars. I saw the way they looked at him. It was not the look of people who were being paid to be polite. It was the genuine respect of workers for a leader who had been in the trenches with them. Andre walked toward his own beat-up sedan, his gait steady and his head held high. He stopped for a moment to check the laces on his own boots, the same kind of boots I was wearing. He did not look like a tech billionaire. He looked like a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. I did not get out of the car. I did not need to talk to him today. I just wanted to see him. I wanted to see the result of the surgery. And as I watched him drive out of the lot, I knew that my job was done. The empire was safe, the legacy was secure, and the freeloader was finally a man. I looked at the $50 watch on my wrist and I smiled. It was exactly 6:30 in the morning. A new day had begun, and for the first time in 72 years, I felt like I could finally rest. I learned the hard way that protecting your children from struggle is the fastest way to destroy them. Wealth without sweat is just poison dressed in gold. When my daughter-in-law kicked my old boots into the rain, she didn't just insult me. She exposed the rot I had blindly funded. Sometimes the most profound act of love a father can perform is to let his children hit the concrete. True respect isn't inherited. It is built blister by blister in the trenches of reality. Today, my empire stands strong, but my greatest investment was finally teaching my son how to work. Did you find this story meaningful? Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to save someone you love from their own entitlement? Let me know your thoughts and tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey of redemption and justice, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of the hidden power of a father's love. Thank you for listening, and remember that it is never too late to reclaim your legacy. I will see you in the next story.